Yeah, it should be pretty mellow.
Ryan and I were saying yesterday we're glad to start off working groups with a mellow one, because the next 2 weeks with ocean and land ice and atmosphere will be a little bit crazy.
Yeah, but this one I feel like I came up really quickly, like it's still January.
Yeah.
Did you want any of us to test our screen share, or should we assume that you've got the backup presentations and we've done this before, so hopefully everything should go okay?
That is the hope, but if you feel more comfortable, we're happy. We can give you that screen sharing. Ryan can stop sharing now if you'd like to just start with a slide and make sure it comes up okay.
Sure, I'll try that. Okay, so you can see it okay?
Yes.
And if
It
I
does
go,
have your, well, no, actually you should use the presenter view, so we can see your next slides on the
oh,
left.
you can. Interesting. Is this better?
Yes, that's.
All right. I didn't realize that preview would show. Well, you can see the thumbnails, I guess.
Yes, and
Okay.
your other files across the top.
Interesting. All right, I will stop sharing. Thank you.
Sure. Does anyone else want to try?
Ryan, could you put up your intro slide again?
Yep, give me 1 second.
Great. I think we should probably get started. People will keep filing in, probably. We're up to 33 right now. So hi, everyone. I'm Steve Yeager. On behalf of my fellow working group co-chairs, Yaga Richter and Kathy Pejan, I'd like to welcome everyone to the second ever Earth System Prediction Working Group meeting, the first ever winter meeting. So this will be a half-day session. We've lined up 6 AGU-style short talks in the first half, hopefully with ample time for questions after each talk. And then we'll take a 15-minute break and reconvene for a few presentations focused on working group activities. These will give an overview of ongoing and planned experiments. And the intent is to initiate a good discussion on where to focus and how to coordinate our efforts in 2021 and beyond. So I wanted to mention a few items. First of all, everyone has already been made aware of the participant code of conduct, but please remember to be respectful today in your words and behavior. Also, remember to mute yourself if you're not speaking. And after the talks, if you could use the raise hand button or the chat feature to indicate that you'd like to ask a question, you can get the questions in order. I think that's all the logistics that needed mentioning. And so without further ado, our first talk is by Andrea Molad, and she'll tell us about subseasonal forecasts with a coupled interactive aerosol model in GEOS S2S. Andrea, over to you.
Thanks. Someone needs to stop sharing before I can. There we go. Got my slides?
We see it.
Okay, great. So just keep track of my time. So I'm going to tell you about some seasonal and subseasonal forecasts with GEOS S2S that runs with a coupled interactive aerosol model, go-kart, and also with a 2-moment cloud microphysics. So it captures the direct and the indirect. Going to just spend a little time on motivation for doing this in the first place for seasonal prediction. I'm trying to inspire some interest in participating in this WCRP S2S aerosol subproject intercomparison. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the protocol. The reason for putting the interactive aerosol and the aerosol cloud feedback in a seasonal prediction system is sort of twofold. First is seasonal prediction of the aerosol PM 2.5 or even cloud drop number. And also we're looking for the impact of adding this to the model on meteorological forecast skill. So GEOS S2S was released November 2017. It's been running near real time since then. Full suite of retrospective forecasts from 1980 to present. The subseasonal and the seasonal were different types of initial perturbations. So those are separate forecast systems. We're about to release version 3 for a long reanalysis and some more forecasts probably by the end of this year. But all of this uses version 2. This is the Morrison-Gettleman-Barahona 2-moment cloud microphysics that we use interactively in our system along with go-kart. So why, we've been doing this for quite some time. NASA has a great motivation to have this included, to be able to use the NASA data to initialize the forecasts and such. But first, there may be some more useful skill in the AOD or PM 2.5 or whatever than from just a simple statistical model. Forecasts of opportunity exist where it may increase weather or subseasonal skill. Tropical cyclones from this last tropical cyclone season, for instance, would be a sort of a prime candidate. It was a La Nina, but we had this big dust event and a nice set of interactions. Volcanic events, some question about increasing the subseasonal forecast skill itself. In terms of subseasonal, there's been work showing connection back and forth, modulation of MJO on the dust and modulation of the dust on the MJO. Some even questions about impact on decadal prediction skill. Community interest is there. This intercomparison is now running. It would be great to have many more centers. CESM would be great to be able to run it with the Morrison-Gettleman two-moment and the interactive Aerosol. There's a little hitch in the protocol involved using the two-moment cloud microphysics that I'll talk about. And there are some other groups now starting to run this. And so what is this experiment protocol? Considering that many models, for them, the control is specifying aerosol amount and capturing direct only, that's considered the control in this protocol. Then a climatological set, an interactive set with an interactive aerosol model, and then an optional set for indirect, in other words, interactive aerosol with the two-moment cloud microphysics. And there's a link for folks to be able to look at the protocol. And here are the particular forecast suite of retrospective forecasts. There's a suite with starting in May, primarily to look at dust events. There's a suite in September, primarily to look at smoke, and another suite in January, primarily to look at some pollution events. The total number of experiments, they're calling 2 because the control for a lot of the centers already exists. So they're talking about 2 and then another optional set. The timeline to deliver these forecasts is nominally the end of this year. Now, for us, running the two-moment cloud microphysics, there's just a little issue with the protocol because simply converting from an interactive to a specified aerosol creates some issues. And so we ended up, for different reasons, here are the different potential strategies that we examined. The one in red is where we ended up. Essentially, if we just specify aerosol and run the two-moment cloud microphysics, essentially, we read in the aerosol, we use it to make cloud. We can't wash the aerosol away. And so comes the next time step, there it is again, and we use it and we make cloud and get very bright. And so we ended up from the full forecast generating a climatology, a monthly mean climatology of the cloud drop number concentration, reading that in during any of the runs where we specify aerosol. And so our names for things are a little bit more clear in terms of the control, because for us, the control is backwards. So there's a run with observed and direct effect. There's a run with interactive and direct effect, and then a run with interactive, direct, and indirect. It's just a little change, but anybody that would want to run with the two-moment cloud microphysics may consider adapting this strategy. And so again, the first look is seasonal prediction of AOD and PF 2.5. Is there skill there? And here, this is on the left is as a result shown in the paper by Juliana Ferreira et al. At 1 month lead, this is the correlation between the aerosol optical depth from the S2S system, ensemble mean, and MERA. MERA assimilates aerosol optical depth, and so it's been shown to agree well with other aerosol optical depth estimates, MODIS, and the stuff that was used as input. And so, you know, correlations up in the 80s in terms of a global mean. At 1 month lead in the boreal summer, this is the best season. There are other seasons where it's not as good, but there's certainly demonstrable skill there. On the right is anomaly correlation of PM 2.5 over the US, also boreal summer, again, where it's the best that it's going to get to. But we're looking at, even at lead 3, we're talking about correlations up in the 60s, 70s, throughout most of the US, mostly in the West. There's a region there in the central related to some pollution and sulfate events, but there is demonstrable skill there. Trying to look a little bit more at other places and places where we may go looking for forecasts of opportunity. Donifan Barjona did this regional analysis looking at East Asia, where there's a trend that we're hoping to capture in AOD and cloud drop number concentration. Hawaii, perhaps some forecasts of opportunity related to some outgassing, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. And then another place is the trend in the US East Coast. So in terms of some results, AOD, here are some line plots of the AOD anomaly in MERA2 versus the 1 month lead forecast from S2S. And essentially we're seeing, again, in terms of AOD, we're seeing demonstrable skill here. You know, a nice, we haven't measured, I don't have the numbers for the correlation. This is really anecdotal more than a statistical analysis, but the correlation seems pretty good. Over the East Coast, there are clearly some events that we're missing, but you know, in terms of AOD, we're quite happy with this skill, even regionally. Cloud drop number concentration, the story is a little bit more mixed. And so again, here for these three regions, our cloud drop in blue, we have the S2S ensemble mean in these plots. In black is modest. Green is individual ensemble members, and the darker green colors correspond to the longer lead time forecasts. And so, you know, this is mean cloud drop number concentration, reasonably reproduced. We get the trend in the US. We have a smaller trend than MODIS, but I think that there are some open questions about the trends in MODIS. But clearly over East Asia, any trend that's there, we're just not capturing in terms of cloud drop number concentration. And the seasonality is there. We have, you know, in places like the East Coast of the US, the amplitude is a little higher than the data would indicate. But overall, cloud drop number anomaly is a little bit of a different story. More or less in the US East Coast, we're capturing the trend more or less. Again, not as great as MODIS. Hawaii, there are some places where we do incredibly well and places where we don't. East Asia is just a mess. So it's possible that East Asia has to do with a little bit more of a convective regime, and that's harder to capture. In terms of the impact of lead time, the upshot here is that lead one over the US, the Eastern US, where we're sort of doing the best, you know, 1 month lead is reasonable. Whoops. If you take a look at the time series in terms of month lead time, we can see that in the US in the first couple of months, we're capturing some skill. Beyond then, it just kind of goes away. Again, this is cloud drop number concentration anomaly. Some forecasts of opportunity, for instance, this particular degassing event. The idea is that after the degassing occurs, there are some potential forecasts of opportunity. That's the time section that we're talking about. And if we take a look here at the anomaly correlation, which is these red dashed lines for AOD, number concentration, and T2M anomaly, we're seeing that after this degassing event that we were talking about, in particular, the T2M anomaly correlation gets higher, and all of them get higher in the wake of these degassing events. So potentially some forecast of opportunity even for cloud drop number concentration, to know something about the clouds and the cloud cover and things. A quick look at some of the impacts of the aerosol cloud feedback on the surface temperature. This is a North American average of surface temperature as a function of lead day in the forecast. Again, the experiments from the protocol call for an interactive direct plus indirect, interactive direct, observed aerosol direct. And here's just a little look at 1 versus 2. So this is the green versus the black curves here are an indication of the impact of adding the aerosol cloud interactions, the indirect effect and semi-direct. And what we're seeing is that an indication here that perhaps early and maybe late, it's not clear, there seems to be some benefit of running the indirect. Obviously, this is just a quick look, and we need to analyze the results we've completed most of these experiments from the protocol, and we're in the process of having a look at it. So summary outlook, seasonal prediction systems can benefit from the inclusion of the interactive aerosol and the aerosol cloud interactions. The WCRP S2S aerosol prediction intercomparison project is encouraging participation from other US centers. The terms of GEOS S2S, ensemble skill and observe a mean AOD and even PM 2.5, there seems to be demonstrable skill. Cloud drop number concentration is a little bit more of a wash. Some forecasts of opportunity do exist. And again, a complete analysis of the impact of all of this is going to be done based on the results of these protocol experiments. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. We've got time for questions.
I can't see the chat when I'm sharing my screen, so if there's a question, if someone can call it out to me, that would be great.
I'm not seeing anything yet.
Okay.
I'll make a comment. Yeah, I mean, I have a sort of a comment. So I think, we're running now, and I'll talk about it later, our hindcast with CSM2 and CSM2 Wacom. So I think we do have the interactive aerosols. We do not have any AOD output, but if there was a community member out there that wanted to take this on, we would be happy to work with you. I don't think I can add it to my list. But if you find anybody else who would be interested, I think we have the skills to join that comparison.
Yaga, can you run any of these with MG running? With the Marcy Gettleman 2 moment?
Yeah, that's running all the time. We're running our default model. So we're running, and even we run Wacom with the full tropospheric interactive chemistry, which is like our most expensive model. Brian has already started.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I think it's brave to show these results that should even try to predict cloud drop number concentration. And I was wondering if you've actually seen any results from other models. I have never looked at this from CESM2, but I was wondering if you know about other models that have similar skill or worse skill than this.
I don't know that anybody else has ever tried to look at predicting cloud drop seasonal forecasts of cloud drop number concentration. I don't know of any other center that's running a 2 moment. And so CESM would be a great sort of a partner for us if somebody there could look at some of this side by side with us and see what's going on, especially since the 2 moment microphysics schemes are cousins.
So Andrea, do you need all the hindcast output, or if we started adding additional output to the forecasts, would that be enough to get people started, and maybe we could get Brian interested in looking at some things?
Well, that would certainly be a start. Of course, it would be nice to have, a hindcast suite with it, and maybe you could consider it in your next version or when you switch to add it to the hindcast suite. But certainly some near real time forecast could start it.
Okay. Well, if you email perhaps myself, or maybe if Brian, if you're interested, we can easily add output. So if not anybody here, but maybe somebody else would be interested in looking.
Yeah, I think we should just add it to the output because we can add it into standard skill scores.
Yeah, and I know we haven't run 2020 yet with CSM2, but we can just keep adding it to the forecast for the 2 versions of the model that we're running.
Yeah, would you be willing to run some forecasts without the either the interactive or the indirect to do a side-by-side look?
Brian, how hard would that be to turn it off? Because that's our default model.
We do have a way to turn off aerosol indirect effects by specifying the drop number. I don't know if that would be good enough to compare or not, but if that's good enough, then that's.
So sorry, you mean specify the fixed drop number or actually use a climatology?
Specify a fixed drop number.
Yeah, we had a little bit of a hard time with that, and we ended up, Donifan, I think, is here and can talk about what ended up happening, but he ended up choosing that we have to go with a monthly climatology to do the best comparison of with and without indirect. But we could talk about the details of that at another moment.
Okay.
Yeah, I hate to cut this off, but we should move on to our next talk. Charlotte DeMott will tell us about diagnosing sources of SST drift in coupled forecast models.
All right, thank you. It'll take a second until I can share my screen.
Do I have to do something to stop
I
sharing?
think we have to hit stop sharing.
Yeah, I'm looking for it.
On mine, it's up near the top of the Zoom window. There's like a red thing.
Got it. Sorry.
Okay, no worries. Okay. Here we go. All right. Okay, so I think you can all see my screen.
Looks good.
Okay, oh, I'm sorry. I'm in the wrong type of view. Hold on. It's playing as a slideshow, and I don't want that. I'm actually in, my apologies. Let me try this again. So what are you seeing now?
We're seeing the thumbnails on the side.
Okay, so let me find the correct window. Here we go. Okay, enter full screen. All right. So I'm not sure why it's auto advancing for me, but we'll deal with this. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about diagnosing sources of SST drift in coupled forecast models from the S2S database. And for this talk, I'm referring to SST drift as the tendency for a model that's initialized with an observed state to evolve to a different state over time. And I think we'll hear a more perhaps elaborate or refined definition of this in our next talk. So I'm going to approach this from the perspective of how SST drift might affect the Madden-Julian oscillation. So as most people here are aware, the MJO is a source of predictability on S2S timescales for many phenomena across the globe. And we're interested in how SST drift might affect the MJO for a couple of reasons. First, the mean SST and the mean column water vapor in the tropical warm pool are highly correlated. So as this plot shows, the mean state SST for November through April is shown in shading, and then the column water vapor or total column water is overlaid with contours. And the spatial correlation pattern is about 0.85. So they're highly correlated. And we care about the mean state moisture gradients for the MJO because this is one key to what actually propagates the MJO and leads to these global teleconnection responses across the globe. And so if you have MJO convection in the Eastern Indian Ocean, it forces these types of circulation anomalies that you see in the blue arrows. And in this region, you can see that you have poleward flow to the north and south, which actually advects high moisture near the equator poleward. And this is a leading source of moistening and eastward propagation of the MJO. So we're really interested in how the SST might affect the mean state moisture and how SST drift might alter that and how it might contribute to MJO prediction skill. So some things to think about in the S2S database regarding SST drift is, first of all, we just want to know, what does SST drift look like across a wide range of models? Can we say anything about the leading sources of SST drift? And finally, which I won't be talking about much today, does the SST drift affect the mean state moisture and, more importantly, the MJO prediction skill? So if we look at drift, there's sort of two patterns we're looking for. One is if we have a drift towards warmer SSTs aligned near the equator and cooler SSTs off the equator. This would lead to sharper meridional gradients of SST. And because of the high correlation of SST to moisture, you would expect an increase in meridional moisture gradients, which would help promote MJO propagation. Conversely, if you had SST drift with the opposite pattern, you would expect a weaker meridional moisture gradient, which would inhibit MJO propagation. So we're going to look at this from the perspective of the climatological drift. And I'm showing an example of this in this slide. So this is an example from the Enso model for a single point in the Eastern Indian Ocean. The black curve is the mean annual cycle of SST at the model initial state. And then each of the colored curves that you see from blue to red is the climatological, is the SST climatology mean annual cycle as a function of lead time. And so you can see this illustrates the drift as a function of season and lead time. So the drift, as I'm defining it here, is simply the change in SST from the model initial state. So that's shown below. And so you can see there's a seasonal dependence. The amplitude varies with season and lead time. So this is an example from one grid point. What I'm going to show next is the drift at 30 days. So this red curve and these plots for sampling of S2S models. And so this is what you see here. This is the November through April average drift from the climatology and the S2S prediction database. This ranges from about 11 years for NCEP to almost 30 years for the Bureau of Meteorology. So the models, the top row shows the three components that go into the Bureau of Meteorology forecast. These models all drift to cooler SSTs. In the middle row, we're looking at the CMA, CNRM, and NCEP models. And then the bottom row is three different versions of the ECMWF model that are reported in the S2S database. And so the first thing you can see is that there's really a large variety of drift patterns. In some models, the SSTs tend to drift warm. In some, they drift cold. The patterns, sometimes they're highly localized, sometimes they're very broad. So again, if we consider that we're looking for an SST pattern that drifts like this, with warmer SSTs along the equator, relative cooling off of the equator, we might infer that this contributes to sharper moisture gradients, which would either help MJO propagation or perhaps slow the decline of MJO prediction skill. And so two models that sort of match this pattern are the ECMWF and the CMA. Although you can see in this plot on the lower right that the SST drift alone is not going to be a good predictor of MJO prediction skill. This largely depends on other factors, probably related most closely to the treatment of convection in these models. So how can we diagnose the mean SST drift? If we consider the drift, the climatological drift, as a tendency, we can write an equation that says very basically that the change in SST with time is a function of the net surface heat flux into the ocean and contributions from ocean processes that also regulate the mixed layer temperature of the ocean. This could include horizontal advection by currents, vertical mixing, changes to the ocean mixed layer depth. Everything essentially that is not correlated with the net surface heat flux can get grouped into this ocean process term. So the way we're going to diagnose this is we're going to regress the climatological SST tendency onto the climatological net surface heat flux. And using that regression relationship, we can compute a portion of the SST tendency that is driven by surface fluxes in orange, and the residual then is assumed to be the part of the SST tendency or drift that is driven by ocean processes. So what I want to do here is just show you an example. And we're going to look at the SST drift averaged over this box shown in the Eastern Indian Ocean. So in the top panel, this is the climatological SST drift, the November through April drift in SST. So you can see it warms by about 0.3 Kelvin over 30 days. Now from this curve, we can compute the SST tendency, which is the drift, which is shown in blue. So the drift is highest in the first roughly 5 to 10 days of the simulation, then it declines. Now shown in red is the climatological drift of the net surface heat flux. And so you can see just visually that they're correlated. Now, if we go through these steps and use the regression coefficient between these two curves, we can predict the part of the SST drift that's driven by surface fluxes. That's shown in orange. And you can see it matches very closely the total SST drift, except for a short period here, which probably represents an initialization shock. Now, the residual is the ocean contribution, which you can see for most of the simulation on average is very small. So for this region of the Indian Ocean, the drift is almost entirely driven by the surface flux tendency. So I'll give you just a second to look at that. So just to repeat, we're looking at the climatological SST drift. We use this curve to compute the climatological tendency. We regress this blue curve onto the red curve to get a regression relationship. Then we use that regression relationship to predict the part of the tendency that's driven by the flux, and the residual is then the part driven by the ocean. So what I'm going to show next, okay, so what I'll show next is we want to evaluate which of these two curves, the orange or the blue, or so in other words, the flux or the ocean dynamics, dominates the drift in a spatial sense. So if I can advance this properly. So this is what we're seeing here. So I don't want to get into the details of how I computed this, but there's a paper by Daria Halkitis and co-authors from 2015. Essentially, this is a balance factor where you can compare two time series that contribute to a change to determine which one is dominating the change. So essentially, it's comparing the root mean square errors of each time series. So on this plot, anywhere you see orange shading, this indicates that the surface flux drift is dominating the SST drift. Anywhere you see blue shading, the ocean dynamics drift is dominating the SST drift. So as you can see, there's really a tremendous variety of SST drift sources across all of these models. At this point, we can't really say what causes, what's driving the ocean drift. First of all, to me, it's a little surprising to see so much blue on these plots. But that suggests that maybe there is some initialization shock associated with the ocean. And this could be possibly driven by a lack of coupled data assimilation in some of these models, certainly insufficient ocean observations, or shortcomings in ocean model physics that contribute to this drift. With this, when you only have the net surface heat flux available to do this diagnosis, you can't really say too much more than that. So just to summarize, the SST drift can lead to background moisture patterns that affect moisture advection and MJO propagation. And so what we've shown here is that the SST drift patterns and the sources of that drift are both highly variable across S2S database models. Ongoing work is focused on how can we better quantify the relationship between the drift, column water vapor drift, and MJO prediction skill. So with that, I will go ahead and close and take any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We have time for a question or two. Maria.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting talk. I was wondering how much variability there is in the SST drift climatology, and does that vary by season? Did you see any variability as well in the components?
Let's see. So by season, yeah, I haven't shown this for all models, but this sort of gets at the point of season. So this is for one model, one point. And you can see an NSET model, for example, in the Eastern Indian Ocean, during the summer season, you have very large negative SST drift. I would guess this is probably related to equatorial ocean dynamics. Perhaps you have too strong of surface forcing maybe your westerly winds are too strong, leading to overly active upwelling along the equator. But that would be something to look at as well. And then your other question, as far as components, I didn't talk about this lower left panel, but the surface flux contributions can be further subdivided into each component of the net surface energy balance. And here I'm only showing the shortwave and latent heat flux components because they tend to dominate that term. And at least for this model in this region, the surface flux drift is roughly equally split between biases in the shortwave and latent heat flux forcing. So yeah, so you can definitely take it further, but I haven't gotten that far yet.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Isla.
Yeah, my question was about this panel and I was wondering, yeah, if you could elaborate more on it. But so I was just wondering about the role for biases in the surface wind speed. Because I know that most models have wind speeds that are too fast, and the analysis increments and reanalyses are always trying to slow down the winds as well. And so do you think that could be a potential contributor, that the winds are just drifting away from what they should be?
That would be my leading guess. Anytime I look at biases in surface latent heat fluxes, because that term is so heavily weighted towards wind speeds, that would be my first assumption. Although sometimes you can be surprised. Sometimes the SST bias itself can cause some of that bias, but my money would be on wind speed drift as being the cause for the latent heat flux bias.
Okay, thanks.
But I see a couple more hands, but I think we need to move on. So if you could ask your questions in the chat, Charlotte can respond there. And we'll move on to Jerry Mail.
Thank you.
Give another talk on bias and drift. Go ahead, Jerry.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. It's queued up here. Okay, I think this is a really good segue into my talk. Charlotte was looking at basically what's happening in the first month of an initialized prediction. I'm going to be looking at what happens in the first 10 years on the S2D timescales. Similar principles will apply, but the timescales are a lot different. So I think that's an interesting kind of combination of the two talks. So I want to acknowledge co-authors Haiyan Tang, who's now at PNNL, Doug Smith at the Hadley Center, Steve Yeager, and Sasha, who are at NCAR, and Bill Merrifield, who's at CCCMA in Canada. So I think on looking at these longer timescales, this is an illustration of the bias and drift problem from the DPLE. These are global mean surface temperatures. The black line is the observations, which you'd hope that the model initial state is at least close to the observations, but it's not, of course, because the model initial state and the observations have a certain bias, and that's what I talk about. Bias is the difference between the initial state and the actual observations. In this case, we're looking at drifted states for lead years 1 through 10. And those are the dots. And so the bluer the dot, the more recent the lead year, and it goes out to year 10, which is the darker red. The gray shading and the kind of green line there is the uninitialized runs that are freely running that starts in the 1800s. And so you can see a couple things from this plot. First of all, if you're looking at the mean trend of the observations, you can see that that's this kind of thin black line. Then you look at the mean trend of the year 1 bias, and the bias here means you've got a combination of the drift, the rapid drifts in the first year, which is what Charlotte was looking at the first month. You actually see already big drifts. Also in the year 1 bias is the difference between the initial state at the first time step of the model compared to the observations. So that's kind of what I'm talking about bias. That's kind of what we're looking at in year 1. And then the drifts continue to occur, and they end up drifting and asymptoting toward roughly what the model, the uninitialized model states look like. So the interpretation from this typically is that you're initializing the model in a state it doesn't like. It wants to drift to its own climatology full of systematic errors that characterize that model simulation. And that's, the drifts then are pretty rapid, and they do get you back to somewhere where the model would like to be, which is not that close to the observations. The other thing you look at here is if you draw a trend line for the year 10 drifts, the lead year 10, you can see that that trend is actually different from the trend in the observations and even the year 1 bias. And that's a problem for when you're trying to calculate anomalies with which you're going to compare to observations. And this is a particularly acute problem for the S2D timescale, because when you're looking at the S2S timescales and you're comparing to a drifted model climatology, and for the S2S timescale, for example, you're looking at the most recent 18 years. For S2I, for example, in the NMME, you're looking at the most previous 30 years. But if you're looking at S2D from the DPLE, and you're looking at a model climatology, you're looking at 62 years. And you can see that over those 62-year period, you can get big differences in the trends, and that introduces problems for how you calculate the anomalies. This is another way to look at how these trends and drifts are affecting the SST patterns, and these are geographical patterns. Obviously, the top row is the year 1 bias and drift difference from the initial states. For the in the upper left is the pre-satellite era, the 1955 to 75 time period. The middle column is the 1980 to 2010, the satellite era. And then the right column is the difference between the earlier period and the later period. And the color bar here is not really instructive because you're saturating the color bar, obviously, in the left 2 columns. But the main message from the left 2 columns is that these patterns set up really rapidly. In the first year, you're already seeing the character of the patterns of the bias and drift that you're seeing at lead years 3, 5, and 7. And so that's kind of interesting. So these error patterns set up really quickly. They're obviously evolving and growing with time, even though you can't see it in this color bar, because the color bar is emphasizing the differences in the right-hand column. And you can see that the differences between these 2 periods are different. So for the year 1, you get a big kind of warm bias in the tropical Pacific, which kind of goes away slowly, and it grows in other areas in the subtropics to bigger negative biases. Part of this is the difference in the drifts. Part of it is due to the difference in the trends between the initial states and the drifted states. So you can see that we're really looking at moving targets here when we're trying to think of bias adjusting to calculate anomalies. Another way of looking at these initial state errors is not just a matter of the trends, but they actually, in certain areas, have a kind of a temporal time evolution, which is kind of interesting. If you look at the top right panel, this is the root mean square error for the whole DPLE. From just the initial state errors, the difference between the initial states and the observations that they were supposed to represent. And again, there's a pattern to this that's not the same everywhere. And if you actually look at these boxes that are highlighted here, and the time series for those boxes, an 11-year kind of window of root mean square error anomalies, you can see that there's a temporal evolution of these biases. If you look at the red line, that's the Nino 3.4 line in that bottom right panel. You can see it's near 0 root mean square error until the 1980s, and then it becomes quite large positive. Then it goes back to somewhat negative after the 1990s. If you're looking at, for example, the subpolar gyre, which is the dashed orange line, it's actually not doing too bad. It's kind of oscillating around 0, but it does have some temporal evolution to the error character. Eastern Pacific, which is off the west coast of South America, that's the dashed black line. It starts out kind of larger positive, and then it kind of has a trend and goes to somewhat negative. If you're looking at the Kuroshio current area there, that's the blue line. It's not doing bad until it hits the 2000, then all of a sudden it jumps up. So this is another factor when you're thinking of doing bias adjustments and then calculating anomalies. These errors are, like I said, they're kind of moving targets. So what we're going to do is look at 3 methods of computing anomalies just to kind of illustrate these problems. The first method is kind of the standard method that's used. Paco Douglas Reyes described this in a paper in 2013, and the Bohr et al. Paper describing this as the method used for the DCPP analysis is in the 2016 paper. You basically take lead year differences from the model climatology, and this is kind of what all the different time scales use typically to calculate anomalies. But if you're looking at these longer timescales for the S2D timescales, as I pointed out earlier in that first plot, the trends and the bias and the drift introduce skill estimates, enhanced skill estimates for earlier and later in the hindcast period. So in other words, if you're looking at, say, late in the hindcast period and the trend is positive, it's going to be kind of warmer everywhere. The anomaly from the climatology is going to be warmer everywhere, and that's going to give you kind of enhanced skill that's that you may not be interested in for internal variability. If you're looking earlier in the period, everything's going to be cooler than the climatology, and that's also going to produce enhanced skill just from the trend. So that's kind of an issue for these longer time scales. Another method was when we were using and you use bias suggested lead year differences from the previous 15 average from observations. And the idea was that for this was to get at this trend problem and try to remove the issues of trends in the model states to bias adjust the model states and then look compared to observations. But the problem here is that you can actually introduce unrealistic skill if the low frequency variability in observations is large compared to the hindcasts on timescales greater than this 15-year reference period. So an alternate method could be to actually use kind of elements of both of these first two and to take lead year differences computed from the previous 15 years of the model initial states. And so that gets at this trend problem because now you're only you're calculating anomalies compared to the previous 15 years, and you're not introducing observations into how you're calculating these anomalies. So we're going to look to see how these various ones kind of function. First of all, just looking at the first two, just to illustrate this issue of trends, the top left is a prediction initialized in 2013 for this IPO transition from 2015 to 2019. That's lead years 3 to 7. This is compared to the whole model climatology. In this case, it was the 1960 to 2017 time period. The observation data is in the upper right panel to compare that to. You're calculating in the same way. You can see that in the upper left-hand panel that it's red almost everywhere. So the anomalies are positive almost everywhere because you're late in this time period. You're comparing the warm end of the trend to the whole model climatology. And then just having everything warm compared to the observations can actually enhance the skill. And actually the pattern correlation for the Pacific in this case is 0.88, which you think is pretty good, but part of that is being introduced from the trend. If you say use this other method, this alternate method where you just calculate anomalies computed relative to the previous 15 model years, the drifted model years, you're seeing a pattern that has more kind of positive and negative areas, and compared to the observations in the lower right, gives you a better feeling for maybe what the internal variability is actually doing on these time scales. And that's pattern correlation for the Pacific of 0.7. So it's less than the top right, the top method, because you've removed the skill enhancement from the trend. Another way to look at this is looking at time series of anomaly pattern correlations using these three methods compared to persistence. This is kind of a way we depicted this before. We were really trying to pin down if we were able to capture the predictability of the IPO in the Pacific. So if you're looking at the bias correction compared to the 15 years of observations, and this again is lead years 3 to 7 from the DPLE. That's the blue line. You can see the blue line, and we thought the blue line would actually be a lot larger than the other methods just because we had the observations in there, but it actually is not that much different. It's actually a little bit below the orange line, which is the whole model climatology in the early in the period. And then it kind of is not that much different from the other methods, which is kind of interesting. The orange line is the anomalies compared to the whole model climatology. And as we said, we'd probably get higher skill earlier and later in the time period. And sure enough, you get up until about 1980, that's the highest skill estimates, that orange line compared to the others. And then again, after about the mid 2000s, the orange line is getting the highest skill. If you're looking at the anomaly compared to the previous 15 years of model climatology, that's the red line. But of course, then you can only use time periods after you've passed that previous 15 years. So we're starting that plot at about 1978 or so. It's actually not that much different from the orange line, which is the whole model climatology, except it is a little bit better in this middle section here, like in the 90s. And so that indicates that that may give you a little bit better estimate of this skill in this middle time period when you don't have the effects of the trend. But the most notable thing about this plot is that there's big dips in the skill in all three methods around after Pinatubo in the early 90s, and again after the Tverver-Nabro sequence in the 2000s. So those seem to be the biggest things that are affecting skill in this depiction of kind of pattern correlations. So why should that be? Why should volcanoes be causing a problem? This probably is illustrated best by this plot in the left-hand side here from Nicola Mayer's paper in 2015, where she looked at the CMIP-6 model, CMIP-5 models, and did a multi-model, multi-ensemble, multi-volcanic eruption composite, kind of a grand composite, to see what the actual ensemble average of all these model simulations would produce, what the models would be trying to produce. So if you're looking at the left column, those are sea surface temperatures. The top left column is at the eruption peak. And you see sea surface temperatures almost everywhere in the tropics are cooling off, except in the equatorial Pacific. And in the panel on the right, the top right, that's the sea surface height, which gives you that kind of orange blob there in the eastern equatorial Pacific that's kind of El Nino-like. If you're going to the first cold season after the eruption, you can see that the cooling is pretty prevalent almost everywhere except for the tropical Pacific. And you're getting almost no cooling in the SSTs, and you're getting this sea surface height pattern that looks like El Nino. And then if you look at the third northern winter after the eruption, now the tropical Pacific is getting cold, while the rest of the tropical oceans are actually getting less cold. And so you're seeing this time evolution in the tropical Pacific that's quite a bit different from what you would think would just be a natural force response. You'd expect that, and what you see in the tropical Indian and tropical Atlantic, it cools off at the eruption peak, it stays cool for the first cold season, and then kind of is less cool 3 years afterwards. But it's kind of doing the opposite in the tropical Pacific. So you get this kind of time evolution. And what we looked at in the 2015 paper was that if the actual evolution of Nino 3.4, for example, in the observations doesn't match what the model ensemble is trying to produce, that's going to cause problems with your forecast scale. But if by chance the evolution of Nino 3.4 in the observations matches what this time evolution looks like in this left-hand column, then you're going to get better skill. And so there's not a good match after Pinatubo and Tverver-Nabro, and there's a little bit better match after Fuego and El Chichon. So how does this relate to these more typical skill measures that are in the published literature, which are these temporal correlations, which are basically you're just taking the time evolution at each grid point and calculating correlations with time. Looking at these three methods now in the upper right-hand corner and the two lower panels, you can see that areas that are darker red have better skill. And this is the kind of typical thing you see, is you see lighter shades of red and even no red shading at all in the tropical Pacific using all three methods, as opposed to darker reds in the Indian Ocean and Atlantic, and especially in the northern Atlantic. And this probably is getting contributions from this complications from volcanic eruptions in the tropical Pacific that we just talked about. So just to summarize, we get in these S2D hindcasts, in fact, on any time scale, the biases and drifts are among the greatest challenges we face in initialized prediction. And the bias and drift and differences in the trends introduce uncertainties in calculating anomalies with which we assess the skill of initialized predictions. We looked at three methods, the kind of differences from a model climatology, which is kind of the standard method, but on these long time scales and S2D time scales, you get trends in bias and drift can introduce problems. If you do the previous difference from the previous years, 15 years of observations, you can get unrealistic skills if the time scales of variability are not the same in the observations in the model hindcasts. We proposed another one, which is kind of a hybrid, differences from the previous 15 years of the model drifted states. You get somewhat lower skill because you don't get the enhancement from the other methods, but this is actually closer to what's being used in S2S and S2I, where they're taking shorter time scales and actually comparing to time periods that are more close to the initial states of the predictions. And finally, the complicating effects of volcanic eruptions in the tropical Pacific cause difficulties with all three methods. Thanks.
Thanks, Jerry. We're starting to run behind, but I think we'll make up some of that time later. So we can take one quick question if there is one. If not, we'll move on to Anish, who is going to tell us about impact of ocean observation systems on ocean analyses and subseasonal forecasts.
Great, thanks, Steve. Let's check. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I'll be talking about the impact of ocean observation systems on both ocean analysis state as well as some subseasonal forecasts. And the bulk of the results I'll be presenting is using the ECMWF system. We have started work to do similar experiments with the NCAR CESM2 system as well. This work is in collaboration with Frederick Wietert, Magdalena Balmaceda, and Bina Sarojini from ECMWF, as well as Yosuke Fuji and Yuhei Takaya from the JMA MRI group. We also have a funded NOAA project. Hoshuan Wei is the postdoc working at CU Boulder. She's leading a lot of the work on the CESM side of things. Our collaborations are with Chris Karnauskas, Charlotte Demott, Matt Mazeloff at Scripps, and Joe as well. So I'll present two results from previous work motivating why ocean observations could be important for subseasonal prediction. So this work looking at an older ECMWF subseasonal forecasting system, trying to identify what's the role of coupling of the ocean in terms of MJO prediction. So what's plotted here on the right is the, yeah, you can see my mouse. So on the right is the correlation scale of the RMM of the Madden-Julian oscillation as a function of forecast lead time. The orange is the coupled forecasts. The green is where the observed SST is used within the forecasting system. And then the blue line is indicating persistent SST, which means the SST is held fixed from the initial condition. So comparing the persistent SST to the fully coupled model, we see a difference of about 10 days out to like week 3 and 4 in terms of forecast skill for the MJO in this system. The interesting thing is even when we prescribe the real SST, which is observed SST in the forecasting system, we get a poorer skill than the fully coupled model, which is indicating that we need, or there is some kind of phase locking between the ocean and atmosphere that helps the MJO propagate in the fully coupled system. So that's indicating some role of ocean dynamics and coupling to the atmosphere in the Madden-Julian oscillation. Another work, which was led by Hyode Seo, who's at Woodsole, was to look at how higher temporal resolution coupling of the ocean to the atmosphere can impact MJO hindcasts. So this was done for the MJO events that happened in 2011 during the Dynamo Field campaign. We ran a few experiments looking at 1 hour coupling versus 3 hours, 12 hours, and 24-hour coupling of the ocean and atmosphere. And the key result from this was being able to resolve the diurnal cycle in the subsurface ocean, which is plotted here below. During the initiation and evolution of the MJO does help moisten the lower boundary layer, which then impacts deep convection evolution in the MJO. So having a higher temporal resolution coupling of the ocean atmosphere helps MJO initiation and propagation. So with that in mind, what we have been doing over the past couple of years is to try and analyze how different observing systems can impact ocean analysis. So looking at Argo versus moorings, which one has a bigger impact in terms of constraining the subsurface ocean. And then if we initialize forecasts from these different ocean states, what would that do to forecast skill on subseasonal timescale? For this, we use the ECMWF ORA S5 system, the data assimilation system. The assimilation is done over the past 3 decades, where we have both satellite data and in situ data. And then we withhold a few different observing systems to see the impact on ocean analysis. So this is just an example of the different types of observations that are assimilated into this ECMWF ocean data assimilation system. This is just for 1 week in 2010. The green dots here are showing the locations of the Argo profiles. The red dots are the mooring locations in the tropical ocean. And then there are ship tracks that are assimilated, as well as even instruments that are mounted on sea animals like seals, which are these gray dots that can go below the sea ice surface and get subsurface ocean data in regions that are otherwise difficult to observe. So the experiments that were set up were, one is called the control, or like the all observation case, where all observations were assimilated into the ocean model. And then 4 sensitivity experiments were conducted, or observing system experiments were conducted, otherwise known as OSCEs, where all moorings were withheld from the ocean DA system. Another experiment where XBTs and CTD data were withheld. Then 4th, where all Argo observations were withheld from the ocean analysis. And then the 5th was where all in situ observations, Argo moorings, all the subsurface ocean data was withheld from the analysis. So we've looked at what's the impact of this on the analysis itself. So no forecast right now, just looking at the ocean analysis. This is a plot showing the mean mixed layer depth over the tropical Pacific. On the left top is the experiment with all data showing the mean mixed layer depth with deeper mixed layers in the subtropics and shallower mixed layers in the upwelling region in the equatorial Pacific. And then the 4 other panels are showing the impact of the other observing systems on the mean mixed layer depth in this region. Withholding the tropical Pacific moorings deepens the mixed layer in the tropical Pacific itself, and most of the impact is local, where the moorings are around the moorings, and that's also indicating. I guess someone is not on mute. Be Chris. So that's one impact of not assimilating moorings into the system. The biggest impact is where all in situ data was withheld. And when this experiment was conducted, we see the impact being larger than just withholding the moorings or just withholding the Argo. So there's a combined effect that is larger than the sum of the two. And then this also impacts the subtropics as well in terms of the mean mixed layer depth. In addition to the mean mixed layer depth, looking at the variability in the mixed layer depth, this is showing the variance in the mixed layer depth. And here, the top again is the variance in the all data case, and then the other 4 panels are showing the difference from the all data case. Here, the withholding the moorings from the data can increase the variance. So when we assimilate the moorings, that reduces the variance in the mean mixed layer depth, in the mixed layer depth, sorry. And then again, the withholding all the in situ observations enhances this effect of increasing the variance. So that can have an implication both for how Enso evolves, for instance, in terms of changing the variability of the initial condition of the ocean, as well as other phenomena in the tropical Pacific, such as MJO propagating through. One of the phenomena we are studying currently with this data set is looking at how does this impact tropical intra-seasonal variability in terms of forecasts. So we use these different ocean analysis to initialize the coupled subseasonal forecasting system. And then we look at monsoon intraseasonal oscillations, so the northward propagating systems, as well as the MJO, which is the eastward propagating systems. For the monsoon northward propagating system, there are several studies as well as theoretical analysis done that indicates that coupling to the upper ocean plays a key role in terms of the propagation of the convection northward. And we see some of this as impacting even the evolution in the forecasting system. So this is just one case study looking at a case where all the ocean data was assimilated on the top, and we use the coupled forecast for the prediction. The middle panel is the precipitation, or observed precipitation, or the reanalysis precipitation, which is still not the best precipitation data set, but it's still within the forecasting system, the ECMWF forecasting system. And then the bottom panel is the case where the no in situ observations were assimilated in the ocean data prior to initialization of these forecasts. So we see an improvement in the forecast of this case when the subsurface ocean was constrained by observations. And we then look at how does this impact the surface fluxes, so the latent heat flux, which does play a role in terms of moistening the boundary layer, atmospheric boundary layer, and helping the northward propagation of this system. We see a phasing in the reanalysis for the fluxes that is phased with the northward propagation. Some of this is evident in the ocean assimilation case, but the no ocean assimilation, we don't see a strong phasing of this fluxes. Then looking at bulk skill score for these experiments, and this is looking at the eastward propagating MJO signal. We see some difference beyond 2 weeks, that a day or two difference in terms of skill when the ocean data was assimilated, which is this red line, but it's within the ensemble spread. So maybe it's not fully significant improvement in skill, but details are yet to be analyzed for this. And then we also see an impact in terms of tropical cyclone energy, accumulated cyclone energy in these experiments, that in most of the basins, assimilating subsurface ocean data enhances the forecast skill of tropical cyclone energy from week 2 to week 4 time scale. So that's shown by improved skill in the orange case, where all subsurface ocean data was assimilated. So then, I just briefly want to mention that this effort in terms of understanding how ocean initialization as well as sea ice initialization impacts subseasonal forecasts, it is a key focus of the WWRP, WCRP S2S project, phase 2, which started last year, and it's ongoing for the next 5 years. There is work done by ECMWF and the Japanese group, and we are initiating work here with the NCAR model as well to study this impact in the CESM2 system. Ho-Xuan Wei has been leading work in terms of analyzing the mean state biases in the tropical Pacific in CESM2. This is just a plot for a paper that is in review currently, led by Ho-Xuan, looking at SST biases in the CESM2, salinity biases, as well as precipitation biases. And in the paper, we go some more in depth into the subsurface ocean processes, and specifically on the barrier layer biases in the model and how that impacts Enso evolution. We are now spinning up to do these initialized forecasts with CESM, where we plan to initialize the ocean with the different Aussie ocean reanalysis. So with that, in the interest of time, I think I'm at 15 minutes. So I'll quickly summarize that we see impact of assimilating subsurface ocean data and constraining the subsurface ocean, having a positive impact on subseasonal timescales. We still need a more detailed study of this, and a study across different systems to find robust signals for this. The Japanese group has performed some of these experiments, and we've got the data for the analysis. We plan to do experiments with CESM2 and perform similar analysis. I think I'll skip this. There was just motivation for couple data assimilation, which would be really useful. And I think CESM2 is really well set up to develop couple data assimilation for subseasonal to decadal predictions. So, thanks.
Thanks, Anish. In the interest of time, I think we should move on, and you can ask questions in the chat. So our next speaker is Eric Chassanier, who will tell us about AMOC in MOM6.
Can you please stop sharing your screen? Okay, so this is a little bit of a different flavor talk, but it's relevant to some of the discussion on drift earlier. So this is work performed at Florida State University in collaboration with Alan Walcraft. So the main motivation is that HICOM, as some of you know, was the first widely AL-based ocean model that was used. And what we mean by ALE is that you allow for a hybrid vertical coordinate that can emulate or change in time depending on what you want to resolve, like in the like pressure coordinates, isopycnals, or you can even be turn following and the thing. But for quite a few years now, HICOM is no longer the only model that is based on AL. We have GFDL MOM6, which is conceptually very similar to a HICOM, but has more modern numerics and coding styles, and now a much larger developer base. And MOM6 is to replace POP2 and CESM. So MOM6 primarily has been used mostly for climate applications, while HICOM, the focus has been used on high resolution eddy resolving configuration. Therefore, there was a desire by the FSU Navy community and GFDL to see how the two models compare on eddy resolving scales. So what Alan did is to configure a test configuration. We use the classic 1/12 of a degree Navy configuration and ran it for 10 years, starting from the US Navy GDEM climatology and using CFSR 2003 repeat forcing. We use KPP, and we remove some of the options of HICOM, meaning that it's the vertical coordinate is only isopycnal in the interior and pressure or Z in the upper layer. So the main difference is that HICOM is non-Boussinesque when MOM6 is Boussinesque. Different equation of state, and also we use a potential density with thermovarsity correction HICOM and in situ density in MOM6. The ALE is implemented using layer averages, meaning we want to keep the isopycnals when the MOM6 focuses on keeping the layer interfaces density. No slip versus free slip, and the ICE model right now, at least in this comparison, is between size version 4 and SIS2. And the model parameters are mostly what we use in HICOM, so that may not be optimal for MOM6. So here is just a snapshot at the end of the 10 years. Surface circulation looked fairly similar. Nothing really major to report here. We can go in some details if some people are interested later on. Computationally wise, HICOM is slightly faster than MOM6 per time step, but in practice, MOM6 is about 50% faster because it can run with a significantly longer Gartonic time step. So now let's go to AMOC. That's where kind of good representation of the AMOC will have an impact on the seasonal to subseasonal forecast. And this is where we started to see the biggest difference. On the left is HICOM. You see that you have a fairly deep overturning circulation. which is characteristic of isopycnol or hybrid models. But it's not the case for MUM6. You see the max at 26 north is only at 2,700 meters versus 3,500 meters in HICOM, and when the observation suggests it's even deeper at 4,300 meters. So, but this is not the, even at coarser resolution, here's a series of plots by, in a paper by Alistair Adcroft. At quarter degree or half a degree, you see that also it does not get deeper than 3,000 meters. So it's not just a matter of resolution. And we started to dig in a little bit. And here is the near bottom potential density in the HICOM, MUM6, and the climatology. And what you can see is that MUM6 is significantly less dense than HICOM or the climatology. Then now we're going to look at a section across here. And HICOM on the left, MUM6 in the middle, and the generic climatology on the right. So ignore the top, the surface, but focus at the bottom. And what you can see is that in MUM6, you don't have any of the initial cold temperature remaining. But the main thing is also that you have some kind of a uniform salinity everywhere, where you don't have the transition from fresh to more salty depths. So, compared to climatology, which is, there's a drift in HICOM as well, but not as strong in MUM6. So we looked a little bit at the possible cause, and historically, like model like the GFDL Gold or HICOM, MICOM, they all had deep Atlantic AMOC, and so there are differences, of course. Between the two CIs models, size 4 and size CIS2. The viscosity, we reran some experiments where we made sure that the coefficient was the same on KPP. That didn't change anything. The other main difference is HICOM maintains layer averages at target sigma 2 densities, when MUM6 maintains layer interfaces with a small compressibility factor. And the other thing that HICOM does is that when you regrid, or when you, in the hybrid scheme, we do it slowly using 1/16 of displacement, which was not the case in MUM6. MUM6 doesn't have exactly the same option, but there is a regrid time scale that can be applied, and that's what we tested. The other thing is for cost-wise, we also decided to do it in the Atlantic regional model, and that will also eliminate the impact, the difference in the CI's model. So here's what we get. So global MUM6 on the left, the Atlantic, you have buffer zones, south and north, at 80 north and 28 south. And what you see, you get a slightly deeper or returning circulation, probably because the way the TNS property are maintained at high latitude. Right here, you can see the difference, but not a big difference. So the next thing is that we used a regrid with a time scale of 4,800 seconds that allowed the regridding to take place not as often as in the original one. And that improved quite a bit the depths. It went from 2,900 to 2,400 meters. If you still compare to HICOM, HICOM is still quite a bit deeper in the rest of the domain, except that instead of 26 north. But it is an improvement there. When you look at the density, potential density in the bottom layers, you start to see now that it's a closer agreement with the climatology. So the three of them are different, but they are closer to the initial conditions. And but if you look at the vertical section, this is true mostly for the temperature. Now that you have, the cold layer that disappeared before is present, but the salinity still is mixed, overly mixed in the vertical, and does not represent the switch from fresh to salty. So in summary, MUM6 was initially developed for climate applications. A broadly similar solution, but the main difference was a shallow Atlantic overturning in MUM6. And so we are not fully 100% sure about why they are so different, but mostly we think that the vertical regrading approach is being more viscous than HICOMs. So I'll stop here.
Thanks, Eric. Any questions? If not, we'll move on to the final talk of the first half, which is Judith Berner telling us about the ASP Colloquium.
Hi. You need to stop sharing, please.
He's stopped.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I had taken my headphones off.
Right. Hello. So I'm Judith Berner. I'm at NCAR. Oops, this is the end of my talk, not the beginning. I wanted to let you know what the plans for the ASP Summer Colloquium and Workshop and how it relates to a bigger community effort related to initialized prediction verification. So we will have the ASP Summer Colloquium, which is a summer school organized by NCAR this summer on subseasonal to seasonal science. It will be virtual and it will be in July. The application will go out very soon and the webpage will open up and we want to have live talks and therefore restricted to 25 to 30 students. We'll have short talks and lively debates so that the virtual format is adjusted to the virtual format. We will also have a small virtual workshop related to the summer colloquium where we ask the lecturers to give a science talk and a related interest rather than a pedagogical lecture. And since we secured funding, there will be a second workshop, which will be in person. We don't know yet when, but before August 2022. That is a typo. And so there, for this talk, workshop, we will accept contributed talks and hope that it can be used for the summer school participants to get to Boulder and meet in person, since at this graduate level, personal interactions are so important. Here's the organizing committee. Anish Subramanian and myself are doing the local organization and the work, but we have a scientific organizing committee. The website will go up in the next days. This is the one from last year, but I just pasted the new dates in. So I will circulate that webpage once it's finalized on the different S2S channels in case you have students or people that are interested in applying. So we have adapted the format to the colloquium to a virtual format. So we have short lectures in the mornings and then longer ones recorded with more details, and we'll have everyday debate to make it lively and interactive. And then we have tutorials in the afternoon. So far we have 5 tutorials. So the students will be broken up in small groups. And one of them is a probabilistic verification with the package Klimpret, and I will talk a bit more about that. And there's a number of things we can look at. The idea is that we want to be able to read in relevant data from the S2S database under WMO and also the American Organized Subx database. This package will do a lot of the pre-processing so that the students can go jump in and just look at metrics they're interested in. We also will have a machine learning tutorial, hydrology application. We have an application of the US West Coast precipitation in S2S forecasts, and then the IRI process-based S2S diagnostics package, PyCPT. So I wanted to talk a bit more about these Python-based scripts, because we hope that all the work we put into them will be useful for the wider community. So we are in the process of developing a set of Python scripts. So it's all on GitHub and Jupyter Notebooks, which deals with some of the difficulties with initialized forecasting. This package is called, well, so ClipRed is just doing the probabilistic verification, but as part of this, we're doing all of this pre-processing. So the leap year is removed, all the issues with the leap year are dealt with, and so the February 29th difficulties are taken care of. It removes a lead time dependent bias, of which we have seen is very important. And so, for example, by running it with and without, we can see the deterioration in skill coming from a systematic bias. Obviously, we want to do this online so that the forecasts get better, but at least this way is sort of a first way of quantifying that. And along the way, ZAR files are created. This is a new format which is used in the cloud. It's highly compressed, but the nice thing is it allows for parallel I/O, and so it's a really nice format to work with. And it's nice if it all happens under the hood, so people don't have to do the parallel I/O in person. And we've seen really incredible speed ups by a factor of 10 or so by going through this format and using parallel computing. Then there is the probabilistic skill. This is this ClimPreg package. And as part of it, we'll provide line plots, bar plots, and heat maps. I'll show a few examples. So this ClimPreg and the scripts have really been developed by Riley Brady. He was a grad student here in Boulder, but is now leaving science. And other contributors are Auron Spring from MPI in Hamburg. Kathy has done the first adaptations to S2S metrics. And right now, Abby J is working with me on further adaptation of this package to a larger data set. We currently run it on CSM, but we have plans to also adapt, make it to run for SubX and have the SubX data readily available for it to be read in. And we are talking to WMS2S. We definitely will have some of these data sets too. All of this is funded as a synergistic activity under a NOAA funded project, which actually is, this is my only science line, so I put it in italics, which is that we want to use this to compare the impact of stochastic parameterizations on the S2S timescale with in simulations with CSM2. Another link to the community is there is the WMS S2S Artificial Intelligence Challenge, which I copied here. So there's a current proposal for this competition to provide the best possible forecast of 2-meter temperature and precipitation at forecast lead times of weeks 3 to 4 using biweekly averages. And the verification is also given. It will be performed using the ranked probability skill score on 3 domains. And so this is one of the metrics that will be available in this print package. So if somebody has an interest in contributing to this and they use ClimPreg, they can put their own AI in there, and then all of the probabilistic verification is already there. Here are a few examples of the kinds of plots that are being done. There's line plots of spread and error. Then there's maps of skill as function of lead time. And then there are these so-called heat maps. I quite like those. So they show you the skill as function of lead time, as the function of initial month, So we can see here, so this is the error, the RMS error. So we can see the error is higher in winter than in summer. But if we compare to persistence shown here, if we look at the difference, we actually see that using a dynamical model as opposed to using persistence, that really is most beneficial in the winter months, where the initialized models are a lot better than the persistence models. And what we see down here is probably the effect of an initialization shock. These are just some examples. As part of the package, you can choose the metric you want to look at, and you can choose the data set and then readily generate those maps. Finally, we have submitted a request to AWS, the Amazon Web Services, to make SubX a public data set. We would use this workflow to create these SAR files and upload them in the cloud. And that means that together with these Python scripts, you can readily go to the cloud, use the data stored in the cloud. So that would make it much more straightforward. And the idea is that sort of all of the I/O is taken care of and some basic metrics are there. But then everyone could use that to look at metrics that are relevant to their specific research projects. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email if you're interested in collaborating or being a beta tester. And I'm berna@uca.edu. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. Are there any questions? So I had one, Judith. Is there anything specific to the S2S timescale in the analysis package that you're developing? And do you think it's extensible to interannual to decadal prediction data sets?
Yes. Riley, Brady, and Aaron, they actually started this package for decadal forecasts. And we're working with CESM, for example, to extend some of these X-array attributes in the JSON files so that the lead time can be years or months and it's not hard-coded. So yes, I think this is just as valid for decadal predictions. And also, for example, Andrea Molot's talk today, what might need to be done is that the verifying data set needs to be provided. And then we can sort of increase the database. We hope to have it in the cloud, so we would put all these verifying data sets also in the cloud together with it.
Kathy has a question.
Yeah, I actually, it's a comment. I kind of want to underscore how incredibly useful and important these tools are, and this setup that Judith and partners are putting together. It really takes ClimPred itself really takes a lot of the sort of I would call the tedious details of trying to get to managing the data and trying to get to your verification scores. It takes a lot of the difficulty out of that and really makes it a lot easier for us to get to those core set of metrics right away. And so I want to underscore the benefit that this has to the entire or system prediction community and across all the timescales that we're looking at. And I think it's going to really make our lives a lot easier. So I really appreciate this significant effort by Judith and the people she's working with to do this.
Sounds great. Is that GitHub repo public yet, or do we have to wait until the summer colloquium?
It's not yet public. So there is a public ClimPred GitHub. And for example, Kathy's SubX adaptations are in there too, or she looked into MJO skill, RMM. Ours is not yet public, but if somebody's interested to develop it with us, we would be very happy to share a developing branch.
So I see one comment from Matthew Rosencrantz in the chat. Isn't SubX already public through IRI?
So the answer is yes, it is. And so I think I hand to Kathy.
Oh, I can speak to SubX. Sorry, Judith, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just want to say, yes, the SubX data is available from the IRI publicly. It is a public data set, but it is a difficult data set to download in its entirety and to use a full set of data, even for a single model or a single variable. It is a large data set, and the download, just the entire demands of downloading and storing and everything is can be quite a challenge for many people. And so I think having it in the cloud, being able to do some remote calculations and only bring back what you want will be a huge benefit to making it much easier to access for everyone. So I really appreciate this effort by Judith and crew to get that data in the cloud.
All right.
Let's hope we are successful, oh.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so we also hope that beyond the summer school and academia, hopefully it could be maybe also used really by down the line worldwide by academia in countries that have less access to high performance computing. And so if the data set is available and also the cloud computing is available, then that would really give a possibility for people around the world to look at some of the SubX metrics related to their forecasting needs with a minimal overhead on.
Okay, thanks a lot, Judith. And I'd really like to thank all of our speakers from this morning for a great set of talks. We ended up only slightly over time, so I propose that we come back as scheduled at 10:50 and we'll reconvene then.
All right, well, it's about 10:50 on my clock. We're going to go ahead and get started again to keep time. So this afternoon session is going to focus on community engagement. So hopefully you all had a chance to have a break and get your second cup of coffee. And first, Steve is going to talk about seasonal to multi-year hindcast set with CSM2 that is underway now. Then I'm going to talk about S2S hindcast set, and we hope that all of you find a way to engage with us, and we'll discuss that and talk a little bit what's the best way going forward. And then lastly, Kathy Pigeon is going to lead a discussion on what are the university needs? What do you need from NCAR? How can we help to create this engagement? And there is perhaps, we don't perhaps have all the resources right now, but having your input would be really helpful in knowing where we should be asking for resources and what can we do to facilitate working with you on S2D research. Okay, so without further ado, I'll pass it over to Steve.
Okay, so I'm going to update everybody on the status of the seasonal to multi-year large ensemble hindcast set. We're calling it SMILE. It's a new Earth system prediction data set using CESM2. And I think I talked about it last June, and we've been working on it since, and want to update everyone on where we're at. First, just some brief motivation. The seasonal to multi-year time scale is a relatively unexplored gap between seasonal and decadal prediction. So if you look at the diagram here from Bill Merrifield's overview paper in BAMS, you can see that this time scale kind of in between the seasonal and decadal prediction timescales is likely to benefit from some lingering Enso skill and some early kind of large-scale low-frequency mode skill, as well as external forcing skill. And so there's potential here that not many groups have fully explored. But there are indications that there's some promise. So there's some papers out, one by Lowe et al. In 2008 that explored extended Enso predictions and showed in that paper that in particular forecasts of opportunity are possible for large Enso events like the 97-98 Enso event. Pedro Dinicio had a paper analyzing the DPLE where he looked at forecast skill associated with 2-year La Nina predictions. And then there's a couple of papers coming out of the Met Office, one that looked at skillful predictions of NAO, winter NAO more than a year ahead. And then a more recent one that looked at interannual precipitation and temperature skill globally, and highlighted again the fact that there might be this potential for forecasts of opportunity associated with hindcasts or predictions that are started from anomalous states in the tropical Pacific. Finally, we've seen papers coming out of the carbon cycle community, ocean, BGC, and land carbon cycle, soil moisture predictions that tend to have skill focused in the early years of decadal prediction ensembles. So there's hope that if we had an Earth system prediction system on these timescales, we'd see some benefit in these variables that haven't been very well explored. In addition to the scientific motivation, there's a desire to upgrade our seasonal to decadal ESP efforts to the new model, CSM2. We've been using CSM1 for the decadal research at NCAR, so we'd like to entrain more interested parties by upgrading, for example, to the CLM5 model, which land modelers are most interested in analyzing. We want to establish a new control for future working group experimentation. And I guess the ultimate goal is to lay the foundation for a seamless prediction system using CESM2 that could span seasonal to decadal timescales and that's a huge endeavor. But we can lay the building blocks for that by doing SMILE, and then expanding it in the future. So here's the experiment design. We're using CESM2, CAM6, SICE5, CLM5, and POP2 with the Marble biogeochemistry component, all at 1 degree, nominal 1 degree resolution. We plan to start 4 times per year, November, February, May, and August, from 1970 to 2019, so 50 start dates. And we had a requirement that we wanted the initial conditions to be extensible both backwards and forward. So if we want to go back in time to fill out the decadal part of the hindcast set, then we want pre-1960 initial conditions. And we want the flexibility to be able to extend these to forecasts in near real time. The ensemble size is 20 for now, and we're going to generate that ensemble using the random field perturbation method that Yaga has been using in her subseasonal work. The integration length will be 24 months. And so the total cost of this initial experiment is 8,000 simulation years, which translates into 28 million core hours. And the resources that we have to bring to bear for that are a CISL NCAR Strategic Capability Award of 18 million core hours. And then we've now gotten an ESP working group allocation. I'll talk about that a few slides on, and we'll tap 10 million of that to complete the initial SMILE runs. And as I mentioned, we're already anticipating future extensions. So in the working group allocation for year 2, we've got 9 million core hours that we could use to do any of a number of things, increase the ensemble size, fill out some of the seasonal start dates, or look at extended multi-year, or even start to fill out the decadal set of hindcasts. So we'll answer the question of what we do after we take an initial look at the first results. As far as initialization, all of the components, initial conditions are derived in some way or another from the Japanese reanalysis JRA 55. That is because it goes back in time to 1958 and is extended to near real time. It's relatively high resolution at 55 kilometers. And it's also the basis of the new JRA 55 driving ocean forcing that has been used for CMIP6 OMIP2 simulations. And so specifically, the atmosphere is a simple interpolation of the JRA reanalysis fields directly onto the CAM finite volume 1 degree grid. For the land, the landmile working group, and in particular Will Weeder and Danica Lombardozzi have helped us with production of a CLM5 simulation. We're calling it SMILE Trendy, that it has a 1850 spin up to equilibrium followed by an 1850 to 2019 state reconstruction, and that uses crew JRA forcing that is from the Trendy protocol. And then for ocean BGC and sea ice, we're using the SMILE FOSSI simulation, which is cycle 6 of an OMIP2 style simulation, forced ocean sea ice simulation that uses this JRA 55 DO. And we've got the BGC tracer forcing aligned with the cycle 6 calendar. And there's an asterisk here because we've made some modifications to the BGC tunings, the sea ice albedos, and we've incorporated a new under ice SST restoring to try to improve the fidelity of this ocean sea ice reconstruction. I'd like to show a few results of why we did that. So this SMILE FOSSI that we're using to initialize ocean and sea ice is, as I said, equivalent to the CMIP6 OMIP2 contribution from NCAR, except we are applying strong SST restoring under sea ice. And we did that to try to improve the sea ice simulation. And we're also running with maximum possible sea ice albedos, again, to try to enhance the sea ice thickness. And the reason is because in traditional OMIT 1 or OMIT 2 simulations with POP and SICE, we have much too thin sea ice, as you can see in this annual mean sea ice thickness plot for the Northern Hemisphere. So we've got sea ice thicknesses there that are below the estimate of what they should be, here below a meter in the central Arctic. And we found that by switching to under ice SST restoring, we're able to greatly improve that. And now we've got thicknesses in excess of 2 meters in the central Arctic. So this represents a significant improvement that will make this initialization and corresponding hindcast much more interesting to the sea ice crowd. Associated with that, we get a more realistic summer sea ice extent. So our old OMIT simulations have too little sea ice extent in the summertime in the Northern Hemisphere. And you can see the difference here, showing a much more realistic summer sea ice extent. And we, I thought I was going to show variability. Let me just mention then that in addition to the improved sea ice climatology, we get a much better match to the observed seasonal cycle in both the Northern and Southern Hemisphere, as well as a very nice match to satellite observed intraannual variability. So this represents a significant improvement in our initial conditions over what we used in the DPLE, for example. The BGC mods that we made were to reduce deep isospicnal diffusion, and that helps to reduce the nutrient drift at depth. So here we're comparing the CESM forced ocean sea ice simulation in blue to World Ocean Atlas data set for these various nutrients as a function of depth. And you can see that our new simulation has much reduced bias in the deep ocean. So that is certainly of interest to people who will be looking at ocean BGC in these prediction simulations. I also wanted to show a pretty interesting result that I should mention. This is a plot produced by Zhang Wu. It shows a difference in the equatorial Pacific thermocline depth in the Eastern equatorial Pacific and Western equatorial Pacific. And there's a bunch of different observational estimates. And then we're comparing the DPLE Fosse, the dark red, to this new SMILE Fosse. What you can see is in the Western equatorial Pacific, the DPLE Fosse is just too shallow. And so we've improved that in the SMILE Fosse, which is pink here. So we're hopeful that this might improve shock and drift behavior in the equatorial Pacific. One final example of improving the SMILE Fosse is the upper 300-meter heat content in the subpolar North Atlantic. The observed data set is EN4, shown in black here. You can see what we used for DPLE in gray, which correlates highly but has kind of overcooked the variance in this region. And we improved that in OMIT 2 and even further in SMILE Fosse, which has the strong under ice SST restoring. So this is, bodes well for improved prediction skill in the North Atlantic. The production status, we've got the model output finalized. Thanks to everyone who contributed to that task. And we've included select daily frequency output for all components, as well as some 6-hourly and a few 3-hourly atmospheric fields. And that amounts to 82 gigabytes per simulation year, which entails 656 terabytes of data for the full experiment, but we can reduce that in half through compression. If you have questions about the output, you can email me and I'm happy to point you to the spreadsheet. But at this point, it's pretty much finalized. Some differences from the uninitialized simulations that we might think of comparing SMILE to. So first we have the CESM2 CMIP6 contribution, and some differences from that will be that we're going to, in production mode, run with this altered deep isopycnal mixing in the POP2 component. We've got modified BGC tuning parameters in Marble. And as I mentioned, we changed the CIS albedo in the SMILE FOSSI reconstruction, and we're going to also change the CIS albedos in the fully coupled production runs. And we're going to use the so-called CSM2 retuned CIS settings for this set of hindcasts. There's also a couple bug fixes. One is the crop harvest bug fix that will be introduced in CLM5. And then we've decided to go with the smooth biomass burning forcing that is introduced in the paper by John Fasulo et al. That I think is still under review. So those are differences from the CMIP6 submission, but it's important to point out that the CSM2 large ensemble members 51 through 100 that are being run in Korea will also incorporate these red modifications. And so the only difference in SMILE from those uninitialized members will be these three settings. And we expect these production runs to begin very soon. I was hoping we could say we've started them, but technical issues have prevented us from being able to report that today. We need help with SMILE analysis. So this is a call for help to the community. This data will follow the CSM data policy. And so I put some of the relevant verbiage from that document here to make everybody aware that SMILE is going to be considered a CESM production experiment. And the PIs of this experiment are the CESM Scientific Steering Committee together with the ESP working group co-chairs. CESM data is characterized as being protected, then early CESM access, and then public. And the policy states that all of the experiment data shall be made available to members of a working group, so early access no later than 6 months following the conclusion of the experiment integration. And then it will become fully public as soon as a scientific paper has been submitted by the PIs or 1 year after the end of the simulation, whichever comes sooner. So I hope that clarifies sort of the rules that we're intending to follow as far as releasing the data. But we do want to know who's interested in SMILE. So I've set up an analysis registry, and I ask you to please sign up if you're interested in this data. That will help us to manage early access to SMILE output. It will also help everyone in this working group to coordinate with each other on particular analyses. And so I think Kathy's going to share this link to the spreadsheet so you can add your name there. And we expect presentation of preliminary results at the summer workshop in June. I want to thank everyone who has contributed to SMILE. It's been a big group effort, mostly people from the Earth System Prediction group within CGD, but others as well. So a huge thanks to everyone who has pitched in to make this happen. And in my final couple slides, I want to mention the ESP working group CSL allocation. We went through this exercise in the fall, and we were successful in getting an allocation for our working group that will cover 2 years starting in November 1st, going through 2022. We were allocated 41 million core hours. You can compare that to what other working groups were allocated. So that's roughly 18 million core hours in year 1 and 23 in year 2. And I'm going to mention a few of the experiments that we included in our allocation proposal. Yago will cover a few more. First, we have allocated for development experiments for anomaly initialization sensitivity studies. And these we envision to be case studies, so not full hindcast sets, but focus studies on, for example, the mid-90s subpolar North Atlantic warming, or the 2015 cold blob, or the 97-98 El Nino, to explore the benefits of anomaly initialization techniques relative to our established baseline experiments. And those at this point will be the CESM1 DPLE and CESM2 SMILE. And the leads on that, it's kind of up for discussion. I put my name, Hu Kim, Liz Maroon, but certainly we don't have necessarily funded projects that will allow us to execute these. So we are very much wanting people to pitch in and contribute to this exploration of anomaly initialization. Another part of our allocation will go to development experiments to look at the benefits of initializing using weakly coupled ensemble DA, again, relative to our existing baseline hindcast sets. And Dan Amrine is the person to talk to about those. So I think he would be happy to collaborate with others on this set of experiments. My talk has already covered our production experiment that takes up a lot of our allocation in year one. And as I mentioned, we've got 9 million more core hours in year two to extend this in whatever way we deem is best. And so the co-chairs are leading this production experiment. And I also then wanted to mention another production experiment that will happen in year two, which are decadal predictability source experiments. That will entail performing the CMIP6 DCPP component C2 experiments. And for those of you who don't know that, that is a set of experiments in which the decadal prediction hindcast set will be rerun over select years in the early 90s using climatological initial conditions in the subpolar Atlantic in order to explore the impacts of initializing the subsurface ocean in the subpolar Atlantic. And so then those will be contrasted with our baseline, which is DPLE. And that will be done in collaboration with UK NERC partners on a funded project. And so we're confident that we have the manpower to pull off those production experiments. That's all I had. So I'll stop there and take questions.
I see a raised hand by Jerry. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so yeah, interesting, Stephen. And could you remind me, when you do the SMILE experiments, are you going to turn off the sub-CI SST restoring, or leave that in there, or leave it weekly restoring, or how's that going to work?
That's a good question. We talked about that. I think we're not going to do any under ice restoring in the fully coupled experiments, but we did decide to go with the modified sea ice albedos. And we had some philosophical discussion back and forth on whether that was a good idea. And we just felt that keeping the model in as realistic a state as possible outweighs the disadvantages associated with complicating the comparison to the uninitialized set.
Okay, thanks.
Pedro, do you want to go ahead?
Just one question and a comment. Stephen, what's the rationale for picking the initial months for the 2-year forecast, February, May, August?
Yeah, that rationale, I would say, came from discussions that we had in a workshop convened by the NOAA CPO office last February, when a number of centers got together to talk about this coordinated 2-year prediction protocol. And Ben Kurtman was leading that. And we got these start dates kind of from those discussions. It's kind of an agreed upon set of start dates for 2-year predictions.
Awesome, it's good to know. And it's also just to comment that it's great that you're planning to do an anomaly initialization set of forecasts. I always wonder why we stopped doing them, and would be great to know if that initialization is better than the current one. I would certainly be interested in probably tagging along and with additional idealized experiments on how to explore that.
That's great. We can add your name then to the list of leads. I agree that anomaly initialization is something that we up to now haven't had the resources to explore, basically. Liz Maroon has a paper in revision that will show some early tests that we're doing, and at least for the 2015 cold blob, it looks like anomaly initialization does not improve our ability to predict that extreme event. But of course, that's just one case study.
Awesome, thank you.
Are there any other questions? All right, why don't we go ahead and move on? And let's see. Hello, so I'm going to talk to you today about the subseasonal to seasonal, or the S2S hindcast with CSM2 and CSM2 Wacom that we have carried out. And similarly as with the SMILE hindcast set, these hindcasts do take a lot of effort, and especially on the S2S end, it's been Jim Edwards and Sasha who've been doing a lot of the heavy lifting. So thanks to them and many other collaborators. So there's 2 sets of S2S hindcasts. The CSM2 is our default low top model, and these hindcasts are designed specifically for community use and as a base framework for research and future experimentation. And I'll discuss some of the planned experiments at the end of the talk. The CSM2 Wacom hindcasts originally were designed to test whether a whole atmosphere model would improve surface prediction skill. And this is a NOAA-sponsored project, and real-time forecasts are going to NOAA for the CPC week 3-4 outlooks in September. So just a short summary here. We have the 2 models. Their resolution is 1 degree. CSM2 has a really low top at 40 kilometers and has 32 levels. Only has an orographic gravity wave parametrization, so no QBO. And the representation of sudden warmings is perhaps not as good as it could be. There is no interactive chemistry, and the cost of the model is about 3,500 core hours per simulation year. And then we have Wacom, which is the most complicated model we have, actually one of the most complicated models that exists. It's also 1 degree horizontal resolution with a top at 140 kilometers with 70 levels. It has interactive non-orographic parametrizations for convection and fronts. And the default CMIP6 version has fully interactive tropospheric and stratospheric chemistry, which puts the cost of this model at 25,000 core hours per year. So hugely, significantly more expensive than CSM2, and it will explain some of the choices we had to make about ensemble size and the dates that we can run. So here is a comparison of what is available right now. We have done the hindcasts following the SubX protocol, which are weekly starts. And for CSM2, the hindcasts already done from 1999 to 2019. 2020 will be coming soon as we can get the ocean initial conditions straightened out. For Wacom, we have the same range of dates. However, the start dates are only between October and March, so covering the broader winter season. And that's due to the expense of the model. And it's also, we expect the benefit of this model to be primarily in the wintertime when stratospheric, tropospheric coupling is at its highest. So therefore, running the summer days, we didn't have enough computing time and we didn't think it was necessary. And for the reforecast, CSM2 has 11-member ensemble, Wacom has 5. We are trying to get CSM2 to start running in real time. Hopefully by March that will happen, because we're going to run out of real-time capability with Wacom by then. And so CSM2 Wacom has been running near real time since September, and real time we are able to run 21 member ensemble, which is really nice for events, especially like the sudden warming that we recently have had. And initialization day, we moved this to Monday. For CSM1 hindcast, we're using Wednesday, but in order to get the data to CPC on time, etc., we needed to shift to Monday start dates. Okay, here are some details about the initialization. So many of them are similar to what Steve has mentioned. We are trying to go towards seamless prediction, but the reality sometimes of running real time didn't allow for that. So there are some differences. So we are using CFS v2 data to force the standalone CLM5 model, and that's how we get our land initial conditions. And those are updated every week to present day. And for CSM2, we are using the JRA55 driven ocean simulation, as Steve described. This one does not have the new updates he mentioned, and we probably should go to that, except we have to rethink whether then we would need to rerun the hindcast set or not, but they do not have the recent updates on sea ice. And for CSM2, for the atmosphere, we do something very simple. We use CFS v2 interpolated to the CAM grid, and we use the random field perturbation method to generate the ensemble spread. Now for Wacom, we need to do something completely different because the model top goes to 140 kilometers. So there is not a single analysis we can take and interpolate to model a grid. So what we need to do is we take the MERA data from 1999 to 2019, and we use that to nudge Wacom SD, which is the specified dynamics version of Wacom. And we do that with an hourly time scale. And then we generate our atmosphere and ocean initial condition from that. And FPIT is the fast processing version of MERA. So fast processing for instrument teams, that's what the acronym stands for. It should be pretty close to MERA, but that's what we're using in real time. So we're able to get that just with a few hour delay from NASA. Okay, so I'm going to compare a little bit of the ocean here since they are initialized slightly differently. So what I'm showing here is just the correlation coefficient of sea surface temperatures relative to HAD SSTs. And this is on these are on monthly mean data from the entire hindcast period. And you see the correlations are pretty good in both models, except Wacom does a little worse in the tropics. And you can see that in the plot at the very bottom that shows the Enso index. And there are just years that the Wacom ocean drifts quite a bit, like in 2016, for example, and more recently in 2019. And we do see that also in the forecasts. But overall, both models are pretty comparable, but except for a few little issues in the tropics there. And here's the surface temperature scale average over global land. And the reason there are 5 bars here is ensemble size does matter. And since we only have 5-member ensemble for Wacom, we're comparing 5-member ensemble for Wacom as well as for CSM2. And for reference, I put out our CSM1 forecast here as well. What you see though from all of the bars here is really there is no difference between all these versions of the models as far as the temperature scale is concerned. The little differences between the bars are not statistically significant. And on the right-hand side is the same plot, but over temperatures over land. So the CSM1 data set only went up to 2015, and that model was basically phased out. But CSM2 is showing very comparable scale, and so is Wacom. And just to give you an idea how these models do compare to other models, I have CSM1, which you can take as a proxy for any of the newer versions of the models for all 4 seasons, comparing to all the sub-X models. And here is CFS v2, the NOAA operational model. And you see for across all the seasons, the CSM model does very well. So it's it has skill basically compared to the NOAA model. And if we add it together with all these sub-X models, then you can see there is an increase in the multi-model ensemble skill. A little bit information about surface. So here is ACC of temperature, and again, focusing on comparing CSM2 to CSM1 and CSM2 to CSM2 Wacom. What I'm showing in these figures are statistically significant differences, and there are not very many places, it seems like, for whatever reason, over Asia, there's a little bit less skill in CSM2. And we do not understand why this could be. There are so many changes between CSM1 and CSM2, it probably would be very difficult to track. But as you see, for most of the areas, except perhaps here for the United States, in week 5, 6, the scale of all the models is fairly comparable. Here's also the MJO and the NAO scale. So CSM1, we already noted that it had pretty good NAO skills at weeks 3, 4. The ACC was still really close to 0.5, and that's holding true for at least Wacom. The CSM, the low top version, falls a little bit below the bar, but again, due to the limited hindcast period, none of these differences are showing to be statistically significant. And the MJO prediction skill is out to about 25 days. And I'm going to mention briefly about recent sudden stratospheric warming event. So when we started the real-time forecast with Wacom in September, we were really hoping that there would be a warming this year. They happen about once every other year, so the odds were pretty good. And we just got lucky. So on January 5th, the zonal mean wind at 60 north and 10 hectopascal has reversed. So you see on January 5th, the wind's dipping down, and there's a huge change in temperature in the stratosphere that accompanies it. But for the purposes of surface prediction, this usually means this pattern of temperatures at the surface. So usually the month after sudden warming, our friends over in Northern Europe and Northern Asia expect to have some cold, bitter weather. And we expect a little bit of warming over in the Eastern United States and over the Labrador Sea. A little bit how Wacom did predicting the warming. So this is the forecast from Wacom in these squiggly lines, and the ensemble mean is in a thick line. Observations are in black. So these are for the forecast started on December 21st. And you see at that point, a couple of ensemble members were showing that a warming is coming. And actually one of them got the date pretty close to observed. When we started the model on December 28th, a lot more ensemble members. So this is about 8 days beforehand, they predicted a warming. And when we started the model the day before, the evolution of the polar vortex was pretty much spot on. So I think we feel pretty confident that Wacom is doing something right in terms of capturing the stratospheric dynamics and related impacts. So this is a forecast that was done with Wacom on January 4th for the January 23rd to February 5th period. And as you can see, there's a lot of cold temperature anomalies predicted for Northern Europe and Asia, and the typical warming that you would associate with the stratospheric warming for the Labrador Sea. So we're right in the middle of this period, but give us another week or two and we'll be able to see how well this model verified. You see that some of the other models, like the ECC, were showing a similar pattern. However, this was a very different forecast, for example, in comparison to the CFS V2. And also the FIM model. So give us another week and we'll know how well Wacom did on this event. Okay, so for output, it's extensive, and Kathy's going to post a link in the chat box with all the output that we have for both models. It does differ a little bit between CSM2 and Wacom. We added extra land and sea ice output to CSM2. For both models, we have 3D fields of omega, Q, T, U, V, etc. Those are post-processed on about 15 pressure levels going up into the lower stratosphere. And most of the output follows the SubX protocol, which is pretty similar to the international S2S database protocol. There is a lot of daily average. Basically, most of the output is daily average. How the averages are done just vary slightly between the protocols, but for most purposes, you're not going to know the difference. So currently the data is available in campaign storage, which is accessible from Casper, and I'm working now with Sizzle to put it up on the Climate Data Gateway. And the data policy will be the same as for SMILE, what Steve mentioned. And we would love to coordinate community analysis. These are the people at NCAR who have already expressed interest in looking at something. So Hui Li would like to look at tropical cyclones. Marika and the Polar Climate Working Group would like to look at sea ice. Danica would love to look at land, but could definitely use some collaboration because she has very little time. And Kathy is also going to put a link in the chat box with a spreadsheet that if you're interested in working on these topics and looking at these, just go ahead and put your name in the spreadsheet. And the fact that Hui and Marika are working on these topics doesn't mean that they cannot use help. So if you're interested as well, we just need to be a little bit more careful about coordinating analysis. For Wacom, myself and Nick Davis from ACOM started looking at the recent sudden warming. There is also, I didn't mention, because Wacom goes really high into the mesosphere, then Nick Petitella is also starting to look at mesosphere predictability, in particular after the sudden warmings, and the model again there is looking really good. So email me or fill out the spreadsheet if you have any questions. And I'll briefly describe the new upcoming experiments. So we have this hindcast set, and there's a lot of hindcast sets out there in all databases. But I think what the unique part of CSM too is we can go ahead and take the model and we can start running experiments with it, which is really difficult with the other operational models that are out there. So one of the experiments, actually it's a set of experiments that I would like to get done this year with our allocation is really hone in on the sources of predictability. So everybody's familiar with this diagram, and that for the S2S timescale, both atmosphere, land, ocean, and sea ice contribute to predictability, but it's really difficult to isolate that. And Paul Diermeyer did some work on the contribution from the land. And we're going to do a similar approach where we just like to change out the initial conditions to climatology. For example, just change out the climatological, the observed ocean initial conditions to climatological ones, similarly with land and similarly for the atmosphere. We already have a set in which we shifted the ocean initial conditions by 1 year. That wasn't necessarily deliberate, but the set exists, which I think is going to be really interesting to look at. So Julie Caron has offered to lead the experiments with the land being set to climatological values. I would love to have some more partners in this. Pretty much most of the experiments proposed here are unfunded mandates, as Steve said, so we would love university collaboration. Ones that are not unfunded mandates are the experiments that Judith Berner is going to do with stochastic physics. So she's going to rerun the entire set with changes, with probations to physics, which will also give us some more information. And Dan would like to do some tests with data assimilation. And we would love to do some case studies. And I think Steve mentioned it, but we would also focus these on extreme events on an S2S timescale. And if you have ideas on which cases would be great to run, if you would like to lead a study, please let us know. The atmospheric model group is also developing a new vertical grid. So they would have much higher resolution in the free troposphere and also a higher top. And we would also like to do a few studies with that model when it's ready. That's not ready, so I suspect those experiments are going probably to go into year 2 of our allocation. So I will stop here and take any questions. Sure. Anish, go ahead.
Okay, just a quick question. In terms of the computational resources required for these experiments, like if university folks are leading some of those experiments, how would we work with it? Would we be applying for additional computational resources on Cheyenne to do those experiments, or would some of them already be included as part of the working group's allocation?
So the ones Steve and I mentioned today are already written into the allocation. So we already have the computer time for that. Then we would just give you the account key because it's for the entire working group. And if there's new experiments on top of that, then yes, you would need a and we would need to find a different allocation.
Okay, thanks.
But the ones that I think you contributed to writing whenever the call was for the computing time, that's we already have that in stock.
Okay, great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I think that raises a good point that in general, I think we're definitely eager to get university help in leading some of these experiments with the expectation that these will be working group products, right? So it will, all of the data that you generate will have to follow the CSM data policy. Charlotte.
Thank you. Yeah, this sounds like a great resource, this project and this database that will come from it. You mentioned that you have added some additional land and sea ice variables. I'm wondering if you either have or have considered adding some ocean output variables. The S2S database has recently started providing two-dimensional ocean output variables, things like the mixed layer depth, surface currents, 20-degree isotherm depth, ocean heat content in the upper 300 meters. Those are some examples, but that could be useful for helping diagnose some of the ocean sources of predictability or even ocean sources of bias in some of these forecasts. So I was just curious if you had given that any thought, or I know resources are limited for data storage. So just curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
So we have mixed layer depth, sea surface height, and sea surface temperatures in the CSM2 hindcasts. So we can't redo the hindcast, but if you have variables that you like us to add to the forecasts, and I guess for CSM2 that would include 2020, I think we'll be happy to do that. So yeah, the mixed layer depth is already there. And other than that, we can add stuff to the forecast and any future experiments that are ran.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll review my list and see if I missed anything, but I'll be in touch. Thanks.
You know, people complain about the large volumes of output, but I think compared to the large ensembles that we're used to running at NCAR, the entire data volume was claimed as very small after we were done with it. And I think that's one of the advantages of, you know, running these at NCAR, that we can host a lot more than, for example, IRI or SubX website. So I think so far, even the 3D variables have not put us over any unreasonable output volume. So if people want to add, especially to the forecast, the output, we'll be happy to do it.
And I just wanted to follow up. I'm not sure if the output from this project will somehow be linked to the summer school that Judith and Anish introduced, but if some of those data tools could be applied to this product, it would really help facilitate some of the participation in this project, I think. So
yes, absolutely. So Judith and Abby already have access to this data, so they will run through these diagnostics. They are working on a figure for the paper that will describe. So I'm working on a manuscript that will describe the two systems. It's basically just a system description. And yeah, Judith, do you want to go ahead and comment on what else you might do with these?
I have nothing really to add, but yes, I think the whole idea is that we join link efforts so that the processing is going to be easy, both for SMILE and the S2S data sets, and then make it available so people can do research with it.
Pedro, did you have a question? You had a raised hand at some point.
No, I didn't.
Okay.
It was from before. Sorry.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, we're going to have one unannounced slide by Katie Dagon, who's going to talk about a white paper that she's working on with Maria Molina about Earth system prediction and machine learning.
Thanks, Yaga. Thanks for letting us sort of jump in here unannounced. Yeah, we thought it would be a good idea to share some plans that we have for submitting a white paper to this DOE Office of Science call that's focused on machine learning and AI for Earth system predictability, to just let folks know what we're thinking about and see if anyone else is interested in getting involved. So DOE announced this call a couple of months ago. They're really interested in big ideas, looking far out into the next 5 or 10 years of research on how machine learning can inform and improve Earth system predictability. And from what we can tell, the sort of near-term goal of this call for these idea-generating white papers is to design a set of workshops to be held over the next couple of years. And the topics of the workshops will really be informed by what DOE gets from the community on this topic. So it's rather open-ended, but they're really interested in sort of substantial paradigm-changing improvements in Earth system predictability that can possibly come from AI and machine learning. So Maria Molina and I are sort of organizing an NCAR CGD white paper, but there are other folks at NCAR working on different topics, and we're also collaborating with folks at CSU, so it's not strictly limited to NCAR CGD. But we thought we'd just give a kind of high-level overview of some of the topics we're including in this white paper, and we can follow up with more details if anyone's interested. So the other component that DOE is looking for is they really want a focus on the water cycle, and this relates to the strategic goals of the particular DOE program that's leading this. So we're thinking about topics around improving subseasonal to decadal predictions, so spanning many timescales, and how those predictions can improve, things like precipitation and precipitation extremes generated with Earth system models. So some of the topics that we're considering in the white paper are how we can bring in explainable and interpretable AI methods to really understand sources and limits of predictability. We'd like to be able to think of the ML and the dynamical models as sort of a cycle of using the ML to inform and improve the dynamical models, to generate hypotheses, to test. We're also thinking about how we can bring in new methods for causality and uncertainty quantification, which are two kind of underexplored topics in machine learning for climate so far. We're also interested in this idea of using the machine learning to do data reconstruction. So can we increase the availability of labeled data for training these models, which is always a very present issue in applying machine learning to climate. And then finally, we're thinking about transfer learning, just meaning, can we train a machine learning algorithm on a particular data set, product, observational product, or model, and then apply it to a different product. So that's what we've thought about so far. If you're interested in collaborating, you can email either one of us. We have a pretty solid draft that we've sent to collaborators just this week. So the timeline is relatively short for substantial comments. We're needing to submit this by February 15th. It's also a rather short document, so we don't have a ton of space to kind of expand beyond these ideas, but DOE is very open to additional topics, so you can find more information at this link below that I can also put it in the chat. So if you have an idea for a white paper of your own, it's not that, co-authorship and authorship is very open, so that's another way of participating. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. Are there any questions for Katie? Okay, I don't see anything, so why don't we go ahead and move on to Kathy's talk.
Right. I am not going to do much talking. My goal really is to lead a discussion. And I have been trying to come up with good ways for leading discussions via Zoom, since we've all been in this virtual framework for some time, and as here as we will be for some time longer. So I'm going to use a Jamboard, which is basically an electronic sticky note board. And so I'm putting the Jamboard link in the chat window. If you click on that, you should be able to get to the Jamboard, and I'll share my screen so you can see what it should look like. And so I'm showing my screen here, and you can see this blank white screen, and there's a title at the top. It says University Needs and Requests for S2D Research. And you can scroll to a second page here, General Discussion. And so the idea is there's 2 pages here that we can put sticky notes on. And if you click here on the left, you'll get an option for a sticky note. So just to show you, that's right here on the left. And I'll type in something on the sticky note. And I remember Charlotte mentioned some ocean related variables would be needed. So I'm going to type ocean variables there and then click save, close that out. And we can see that ocean variables is now on the sticky board, on the Jamboard as a sticky note. So I'm going to encourage everyone to just start putting out their ideas of the things that you would like to see related to S2D research from the Earth System Prediction Working Group. You can put it under university needs, or you can put it under general discussion. And so I think this is what I do when I teach class. I set a timer and I say, give the students, say like 3 minutes to do something, to do a task. And then we stop in a few minutes and talk about it. So how about I give everyone 3 minutes to put some notes on the sticky board, and then we can talk about some of these things, elaborate a little more, and see where this discussion goes. And feel free to speak up if you have a question, or put something in the chat window, which as usual disappears on me. And Charlotte, I remember you mentioned several things more than just ocean variables. So feel free to put those sticky notes up there. That would be really helpful for us to capture the request that you made. And so go ahead and put those things up there. It seems people are just getting going, which is usually the way it works with this. It takes a few minutes to get everybody going. We'll do about 2 more minutes and then see how things are going and discuss the ideas that people are posting. All right. So we've had about 5 minutes of people putting ideas up on the Jamboard. Please keep going. You don't have to stop, but it's probably a good time to maybe start looking at some of the things that have been posted and further the discussion. So I'll just mention some of these things that I see posted, and if you're the poster or if you have an opinion about it, feel free to raise your hand and tell us more about what you have to say about it. I see a number of sticky notes about dealing with the data, the example software, some pre-processing, a video, and open source scripts for computing things like model drift and bias, scripts for pre-processing, these kinds of things. I also see tropical cyclone tracks, and I see some +1s appearing. So if anybody would like to speak up and give a little more detail about what they would find useful in terms of this sort of data handling effort, that would be really great. And I can't see everyone, so you see a hand. Yep. I'm not seeing any volunteers. Judith?
Hi. So I think some of these pre-processing issues, they can and should be handled by a community package. I am offering our effort and make it available to the community so it can be adjusted for all the needs. But I think all these things like dealing with leap years, removing a lead dependent bias, these are things that shouldn't be duplicated, but there should be sort of one script, one framework that everybody can use and then can start doing research for the subject of their interest.
Yeah, thanks, Judith. I really do think this is something we've been needing for a long time. And now that these large hindcast data sets have grown dramatically and continue to grow, there's really a need to make it a lot easier for everyone to access that data and do the basic things so that we can get to the exciting scientific part.
And I hate to say this, but obviously funding is something. This is a service, and currently there is no obvious funding for this. And so we all leverage other funding. And so I saw some program managers on the list of participants, but this is something that's really important. And it's really great if there's funding for it, or at least understanding that that's part of what we have to do within the framework of funded proposals.
Yeah, thanks for that, Judith. It's true. This is really a critical service to the community. It's not trivial to do all of this kind of data assistance, and it's also not glamorous, and doesn't necessarily lead to a lot of papers or a lot of things that are recognized as critically important from a scientific perspective. Yet it underscores the critical foundation of us being able to do our system prediction research.
I'd like to inquire a little bit about who put down the card about the making a wrapper to run the forecast. And I'll tell you what we have right now for running S2S. We do have this silk suit, which basically it's a suit that has some scripting in the back, but it runs the entire year or even more of hindcast pretty automatically if the data is in the right place on Cheyenne. You would not be able with the GUI to change parameters in it. And I'll be curious if maybe whoever put the note, if they can elaborate what kind of parameters you're wanting to change. Probably we're not going to link every parameter in the model to this suite, but if putting out this suite and instructions how to run that would be useful to the community, that there would be something we can ask for resources for. It just would be good to have an idea how many people would actually be interested in running these forecasts themselves.
So that was me, Yaga, Anish. And I mean, I was just thinking about an example, like at ECMWF, they have this GUI that you can change the ensemble size, for instance, or like change, if you have stochastic parameterization, you can change parameters of the stochastic parameterization, or even like some key variables, like how often you couple the model in the forecast framework. Or yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be detailed parameters, but like standard parameters that people could change in initialized forecast. If those are included in an easier way to change than having to go and change scripts within the model directory, that could make it easier for students, like especially thinking about students, like grad students, to pick it up and run it quickly. Right? That was the thought process, and yeah, putting it there. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll also mention that I taught a system modeling class this past semester, and Yaga gave me some scripts and setup for running an example hindcast, so the students at least got an experience of how would you set up the model to run a hindcast. And so and I've documented that in open source on GitHub. And so it might be a framework going forward for making it as a nice example for others to be able to run hindcasts if they wanted. The biggest challenge is initial conditions. And so I've put a sticky note in for, the easy access to initial conditions for different kinds of setups is probably the biggest obstacle for that.
Is it safe to assume that students have access to Cheyenne or Casper, or would the initial conditions be need to put out for somewhere where you can download them to a system that your students can access?
From my perspective, I feel like people have access, especially in a class context. We get a classroom allocation, or students can request a student postdoc allocation in order to be able to run, hindcast, and then if they wanted a larger allocation for a particular set of experiments. So I think assuming that students have access, or in general that researchers have access to Cheyenne, is reasonable if we just know where to find the initial conditions.
Yeah, so right now we have all initial conditions we have on campaign storage, and they're going to remain there, I think, for a very long time, because CSM2 is going to be with us for a long time. So I think as long as the grids in CSM are not going to change, which is not going to happen anytime soon, then we have initial conditions we can point you to pretty easily.
All right, some other things posted here. I see reference to tropical cyclone tracks. Yeah, it's definitely not trivial to try to identify tropical cyclone tracks in the model output. And I assume that might be what you're asking for, whoever posted this, but is there a tracking system that could be run on the data that could then be provided? And whoever posted this, if you'd like to speak up, feel free to do so.
It was me. I was thinking about like the parameters or variables required to run a tropical cyclone tracker. You need like multiple variables at a high temporal resolution, like a 6 hourly or at least a daily resolution. So the data requirement is pretty large. If the tropical cyclone tracks can be provided as kind of like a standard output or something, then people don't have to download a large volume of data to do this themselves. I understand that like with different trackers, you may have like different tropical cyclone tracks. Maybe like running the GFDL tracker, a commonly used tracker, would be helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. I don't know from the model, running the model side of things, if that's something that's easily doable or not. But no, Yaga, can you speak to that? I don't know.
Yeah, I've never run tropical cyclone tracks either. Is there anybody else on the line who may be able to comment?
Basically, it's kind of like a post-process step. You have like if you have like a 10-meter wind, 850 vorticity, and the temperature field, you can process these variables and produce tracks.
So I know Hui Li is wanting to look at this. So after she's not on the line, but she's requested specifically 6 hourly instantaneous output of several variables, including the surface wind. So after she does the analysis, maybe she would be willing to share. If there's an update to that, we can let you all know.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
John Truesdale has run some trackers in the past, and each one is a little bit different as far as what they need. But I think that's the most likely scenario would be someone who does that post-processing with the field's output could provide tracks as long as whatever scheme they're using is acceptable to everyone. Because otherwise trying to get software engineering support to add that into the model itself to just output tracks is, I would say, unlikely.
Oh, sorry, I did not mean to like add trackers into the model and output this along with the other variables. It's more like a post-process task.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would also add atmospheric rivers to that as a sort of value-added post-processing step, that if someone performs that processing and gets a publication out, then that's a great contribution to the working group as a whole to kind of include that as part of the data set that others can then look at.
All right, great. That sounds like a promising avenue that we could look into. I want to see about some of the other comments on here. I think a lot of these, okay, so there's one about subseasonal forecast initialized with different ocean initial conditions, like what was presented by Anish. So I'm not sure exactly what this is asking for. So maybe if you posted this, you'd like to elaborate. Is this asking for these forecasts to be run or to be made available, or what's the request here?
Oh, hi, I'm Hoshen. I wrote this, and we're just thinking that it will be, we want to request to run this with the under Yaga's framework, but it will be, we're willing to run it, but it will be good to collaborate with people from NCAR. So it can maybe make this more maybe it will be more easier to run with the help. So and then the initial condition we're thinking is what was proposed, what was presented by Anish earlier, that with different data assimilation, like from different source of data, we can get different, for example, like the mixed depth distribution. So that's that would be interesting to see, for example, whether this different initial ocean condition will influence like MJO forecast. But we think that maybe starting from like all, if we're focusing on MJO forecast, then maybe we can start from only like winter month. But this simulation can also be helpful for other scientific question too. So maybe we can try to run it from all the months during the year.
All right, thank you. Yaga, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, I think that's exactly those kind of experiments is what we hope the community would want to do. So yeah, go ahead and send me an email and we'll be happy to help. Like right now, I would still have to help you to get set up. And we'll try to work on a simpler way for the communities to be able to run the hindcasts themselves. But all the initial conditions for the atmosphere and the land are available. So it would be just a matter of copying the running suite and pointing to different initial conditions. Otherwise, everything else could be ran the same way and you could just select the winter months to run, etc., or just specific cases.
All right, I see requests for verification data on the model grid. I think this sort of goes with the pre and post processing type topics. And then I see this here in the middle, a front page with seed ideas for interesting applications of S2S output. This is really interesting post here. And so I'm wondering if the person who posted this would like to elaborate on it a little more.
Hi, Kathy. Yeah, this is Charlotte DeMott. I posted this because this is something I've been thinking about recently. And it sort of goes back to the discussion we just had about making some of these resources available to ease the acquisition or processing of the data. And if I think about this in a bigger context, I really see analysis of forecasts of, for example, ecological disasters or something. I see these as being potential bridge activities to bringing new students into Earth system science and Earth system modeling. I'm co-director of an REU site here at CSU, and there's tremendous interest among our undergraduate applicants to focus on a problem that is relevant to society. And S2S forecasting is so relevant to so many sectors, both commercial, ecological, public safety. I feel like there's so many hooks to bringing in a broad diversity of students into the field. And so they come in with so much interest in these topics, but if they are first tasked with figuring out how to process data, it can be a real barrier and a real turnoff. Particularly, I would really hesitate to ask a summer REU intern to tackle one of these projects without myself first really just acquiring all the data, setting up things, making sure it was a smooth takeoff for them. So, you know, if this is a project that's being run through NCAR and NSF, then perhaps it would be really helpful, not just for those of us on this call, but for the community in general, to really put some resources towards building up these software tools to sort of help lower this barrier to everyone. So yeah, that's sort of a big picture comment here, but I see these ideas about community resources to help process the data as having a far greater reach than to those just here on this call.
Shara, I'll comment on that, and I wish we had Eric DeWeaver here on the line, but we don't. But we do have Gokhan, who is the CSM chair, so he can maybe talk a little bit about the resources and how we might go about getting those. But I would just comment, partly what you're bringing up is reaching out to these areas is why we added a lot of extensive outputs. So we have things like projected leaf areas, total ecosystem carbon, things that other S2S places are not putting out. And I was talking to Danica a little bit more. She's a little bit more familiar with the land model than I am. And we're planning to also add a lot more output in terms of crop variables, like things that students can easily relate to. We'll include those in the real forecast. But yeah, I think just getting over that line, how do we get that output into audiences that is easily accessible is huge. And there's so many details in the model, but I think maybe between Judith's effort, but I think in either case, we will need to advocate for some resources that are dedicated. So I don't know, Gokhan, if you're paying attention and want to make a comment, that would be great. Put you on the spot. Okay, maybe he's having lunch. But yeah, we will bring that up. So partly why we wanted to have this discussion at this meeting is to see what the community needs are, because the ESP working group is very new. So we have very little resources dedicated to it. We don't have a liaison right now. So we're trying to justify the need for having one. So having these conversations is really useful because we can see where the community need is and what NCAR should be putting their resources on, right? There's so many things we need to resource, but I think this is an important one.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to underscore that, these data sets are challenging for those of us who are used to working with large climate data. So imagine coming in as an undergraduate researcher or a new graduate student, how difficult it is to deal with these data sets. And so this seems to be really, really critical.
Yeah, I'll just follow up real quickly. It's really fantastic to hear about all the additional output variables that you're sort of curating from input. I think that in itself is a very important step to take. So thumbs up.
All right, I'm seeing a new sticky note that's too small for me to see. Whoever just posted that, if you want to elaborate, please.
I can, yeah, so do we have a single document that lists like all ongoing projects, either funded or unfunded, that are relevant for this working group? I think you did share like a couple of Google Sheets that people could list their interest in using experiments that have already been done, but potentially having like one document listing already ongoing projects that if people are doing this same thing or doing similar things, that they could collaborate or not do multiple efforts for the same research, right? Would it be useful to have a shared document that lists ongoing projects?
Yes, I think that's, go ahead. I think that's the idea of these spreadsheets that you and Steve had me share for the data access, but go ahead and elaborate.
I was just adding, so we're a little behind getting the description. We can get some of that on the main ESPWG website and then link from there to these Google Sheets. So that's a great idea. We should put that on the top of the list to dos for the co-chairs. I think if you look at the climate variability website, that's kind of how they operate. They list all the simulations that are going on their website and they link to that. So that's the model that we are sort of planning to follow.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yep.
All right, I think that we've addressed all of the sticky notes that have been posted. If anybody else wants to post or a sticky note and or speak up regarding needs for community needs, university needs for STD research. All right, I'm hearing silence and I can't see the chat window as usual. It disappeared on me.
Kathy, there is a comment from Kevin Reeder about the availability of reanalysis from DART. Kevin, do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Sure. It seems like that might be a kind of contrasting data set that might be used for comparison with hindcasts that are done with the ESP or SMILE data sets. You can compare the influence of different initial conditions on hindcasts that you want to do. It is a more limited in terms of dates. It only spans 2011 through 2019, but there could be useful data there if anyone's interested in using it. Was there more that you're interested in hearing about?
No, that's great. And people, this way people have an opportunity to ask questions.
I guess the important difference here with this data set is that they're pretty tightly constrained to observations all over the globe. And they could be used for verification as well. You could do hindcasts and then compare the final model states against these reanalyses, find out how much you've drifted from what actually happened on the Earth.
And which 9 years are available? Is it the last 9 years?
Yeah, 2011 through 2019. We'll probably add 2020 sometime in the next year.
So I'll put out a question to the community, which is one we never get an answer to, but it's how do we, what's the shortest amount of forecast or hindcast that we can run to test a change in initial conditions or a change in model physics, or if anybody has an idea how to do this efficiently. Because as Kevin mentioned, let's see, changing the initial conditions to something different is one change. And we have a list of about 20. The model resolution, changes in convection parameterization, etc., that we would love to test. But the only way so far that we have of testing is rerunning the entire hindcast suite and for a given season, which is like 20 years of hindcasts. So if anybody has thought of a better method, maybe Andrea, I'm not sure if she's still on the line, what they do at NASA, that would be great. I think Isla at some point made suggestions to figuring out how many hindcasts we would need to run. But I think that's a fundamental question that if we had a consistent answer to that, we would be able to do more research. And it goes across the timescales, not just on S2S.
We've had some success not for subseasonal, not for week 3, 4, but for the seasonal ones. We've had some success just sampling out of a couple, again, 1 month of initial conditions. We picked the hardest one and then sampling out of the different phases of Enso. So instead of having to run every single year, sample 3 La Niñas and 3 El Niños and 3 neutrals or something like that. It cuts the number of them in about half. And we did that and didn't find any surprises when we brought up the full system. But there's no easy answer to this, as you guys all know.
Okay, thank you. That helps.
All right, I noticed when I was moving some of the sticky notes around, there was one that kind of got covered. So I want to make sure whoever posted that gets a chance to speak up. There's a research suggestion about S2S predictability might be limited by model error, for example, in the West Pacific. How can we include OBS in this effort to fix the model error? So I think this is getting at kind of how can we better incorporate observations for improving models. But whoever posted that, if you'd like to speak up about that, please feel free to do so.
That was me, because I'm interested in model error. And I think a lot of these tools, it's great to develop for assessing the predictability within the modeling framework. But some of the shortcomings, especially in the West Pacific and Enso, is that there's systematic model error. And I do not know, I don't have an answer, but I would love to link this effort of verification with where's the model error coming from and how can we improve models to get better skill especially as compared to, let's say limbs where fitted on data that don't have that type of model error. And I have no answers, just I think this is an exciting research project.
Thank you, Judith.
I had,
open. Go ahead.
Okay. I had another question. How, I mean, for instance, if we want to do case studies, let's say of tropical cyclone forecasts on subseasonal or shorter time scales, how easy would it be to switch between operational initial conditions of NSEP or ECMWF or like the CAM Dart and initialize forecasts and run it from there to see the impact of initial conditions from different centers on the forecast scale, right? I think operational centers do this on, at least internally, they do it internally on a regular basis, but is that something feasible to do easily with our system now?
So for the atmosphere would be super easy, and I'll let Steve comment about the other components because I think it's not as easy.
Well, I don't understand how operational centers achieve this in any kind of efficient way. Do they rerun their full set of hindcasts?
No, just for case studies, Steve. Like there's some. I think one of them is like Linus Magnusson has led a paper on like the Hurricane Sandy forecast using like NSEP, Japanese initial JMA's initial condition and ECMWF initial condition to figure out like if it was the initial condition that was a problem to predict Hurricane Sandy, right? Because NSEP was showing that it was going offshore, whereas ECMWF had caught on to the forecast that it was going to make landfall over New York at an earlier time. So yeah, trying to see if it was the model that was the problem or just the initial conditions that was a problem.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll just speak to this from the longer timescale perspective. I mentioned that we have allocation to do anomaly initialization experiments, which is our only way of doing case studies, because we can swap in different state data set for the initial condition and not have to worry about drift. But it raises this perennial question of how to verify in a case study and what can be concluded from a single case study. And so I think we need kind of community ideas, community consensus on what the key case studies are for different timescales. And for Decadal, we've got a couple now, and the key ones are the mid-90s warming of the North Atlantic, and then a 2015 cold blob event in the North Atlantic. But for the seasonal to interannual timescale, I think the jury is out where we should focus our attention as far as these case study experiments to look at the sensitivity that you're asking about, which is sensitivity to initial condition.
Yeah, I'm curious, Anish, if maybe you are more getting at the kind of technical aspect of if I wanted to run the model with a different set of analyses, for example, just as a test to see for some particular experiment I wanted to do, how easy is it to produce initial conditions for each of the model components? Yeah,
exactly, Kathy. And an example, I gave an example of a hurricane like Hurricane Sandy, but another example is the seasonal forecast of Enso for 2014-15, which was a failed El Nino event compared to the 2015-16 event that happened, right? And I think like the NSEP system got it wrong in terms of they did predict like an active El Nino in 2014-15 and like downstream teleconnection also of El Nino events. So if we identify like bust cases for some systems and then we let's say, want to run CESM2 with the NSEP initial condition, and then see if, like with the CSM model, but using NSEP initial conditions, if we can get the forecast right, that would indicate that there's a problem with the NSEP model, that it didn't get the forecast right, even though the initial conditions are the same. So something like that, where if we want to do case studies with one model, but different initial conditions.
Right, and even sometimes I might want to create some idealized initial conditions for some sort of idealized situation for a research question. And so this whole issue of how do I produce initial conditions for the model for, say, the atmosphere, the ocean, the land, ice if it's needed, other components, that's not trivial to do. And so having the ability to do that would certainly be helpful for research questions.
So for the atmosphere, I think it's pretty easy because we just usually take a different reanalysis and regrid it to the CAM grid and off it goes. So that's pretty simple. Steve, do you want to?
That's not easy in terms of the vertical, right? Like you can do that horizontally, but if I have a, say, I don't necessarily have the data I need on all of the model vertical levels.
So we have interpolation codes. So like we interpolate both CFS v2 and ERA interim. So I guess it's maybe I find that it's the easiest because I'm most familiar with it, but we have the codes to take. I think now for Steve's runs, we have the codes for JRA 55 reanalysis. We have the code for ERA interim, and we have it already set up for CFS v2. And for some of the runs that I was going to do, I was just going to make climatologies out of the existing conditions, for example. So the same way you could change out, you would read in the initial conditions in those files and then just change them and write them back out to that file. But Steve, do you want to talk about the ocean? What are their flexibilities for changing the ocean?
We're not very flexible. And if you change the ocean, you're going to change the drift. So, it's back to this question of how to do case studies in the context of a drifting prediction system. So, there's certainly a possibility of interpolating ORAS4 to the POP grid and doing anomaly initialized case studies. But I wouldn't say it's easy.
And then the land is also not trivial, right?
Yeah, Julie, are you able to talk about the land, or Nan, maybe somebody else on the line?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a little while since I've done it, but it's non-trivial also to get everything set up the way the model's expecting it.
So for the drift, just a quick question, Kathy. So in terms of the drift problem for the ocean and land, and potentially there would be either a drift or an initialization shock for the atmosphere as well, right? That if we use an initial condition that CAM doesn't like it, it would convect a lot and precipitate a lot or something. Have you noticed that, Yaga, in terms of, do you need to nudge the model to some kind of a balanced state if we initialize it with a different model's reanalysis? Or
So the only time we had an issue with it is with Wacom because it's so high up, and when we nudge it to Mera with that really short 1 hourly time scale, sometimes we need to run with a really a high end split. So really something different for the first day as the model adjusts, but for the atmosphere, it hasn't been really a problem. So we when we put in the ERA interim or CFS reanalysis, the model tolerates that really well. Like every 1 in 1,000 forecasts maybe fails because of that, but it's been really rare.
Okay.
But yes, there is a shock, but the model doesn't seem, it recovers pretty quickly in a day or two.
Okay. Thanks.
Brian has a comment.
I just wanted to say that I haven't looked very carefully at CAM6, but in previous versions of the model, we did see a lot of noise in the first couple of hours after initialization. So a large convective anomaly usually happened within the first 3 hours. That can influence the skill later down the line, but it's limited to the first few hours of the simulation. And we definitely saw differences between MERA and ERA interim initialization.
All right, I think we're close to wrap up time, if that's correct. Yana?
I think we have one more raised hand from Judith, but yes.
I think hers was still up from before, but if
Okay.
not.
Then I think we're good.
Sorry, yeah, it is not up.
Okay, so one request I have from Elizabeth, if you were a speaker today, if you could please email Elizabeth your presentations, they will be posted online. Well, I think then that's it. Thank you very much all for participating. It was really great to hear all your input. If you have any questions, please email the co-chairs, and especially about the upcoming simulations. We'll try to get more information out on the website as soon as we can, but emailing Steve or myself or Kathy is probably the best way for now. We'll come up with a better way for the future. And we plan to have another working group meeting, I guess, during the June CSM workshop. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks to Steve and Yaga for organizing this working group. I think it's great. I think it's important in the US.
And Kathy are
delighted to see that.
Steve and Yaga did most of the work.
And Kathy, sorry.
Sorry.
I just want to say too that I saved the chat. It seemed like there was a lot of really good resources that were posted there. So it downloads as a file. So if you want me to send that to you as co-chairs to process, I can do that.
Great. And Steve and Kathy, we do need to make a slide for GoCon. I don't know if you, if we want to just stay on and just put down some thoughts, or do that tomorrow or some other day over email, whatever you prefer.
I have a half hour because I have a faculty meeting.
If you could post the chat thing and make it available to the rest of us, that would be great too. That's my request. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Andrea. We'll be in touch.
Yeah.
So the Jamboard was a pretty good way to kind of collect the synthesis, I guess, of everyone's.
Yeah, and I can download that as a PDF, so we have we can capture it basically.
That'd be great. I've been taking screenshots because I think, yeah, so Kathy, what we're trying to do, well, is justify having a liaison for the group, that we actually have some help. Because as you notice right now with all the university requests,